My wife's male boss mocked me at her company's dinner party. She could do way better than you. I shut him down in front of everyone. My wife snapped. Apologize, or we're over. I smiled. I didn't say a word. But when she came home weeks later, she finally learned what done really means. 3 years into marriage, I thought Olivia and I had it all figured out. We were that couple people used as proof that adulting didn't have to look like chaos, at least from the outside. We had matching coffee mugs, a shared Spotify playlist, and a mortgage that made us feel both proud and perpetually broke. I was the calm, numbers-obsessed financial analyst, the guy who got excited over balanced spreadsheets and free donuts in the break room. Olivia was the ambitious, type A marketing executive who could make a PowerPoint presentation look like a TED Talk. She had this way of making every idea sound like the next big thing, and every meeting feel like a Super Bowl commercial pitch. Together, we were a highlight reel of fake stability, me doing the math, her doing the magic. Olivia was magnetic, the kind of woman who could convince a vending machine to give her free snacks just by smiling at it. People at her office adored her. Her boss, Richard Hayes, adored her a little too much. The man had a knack for appearing in our marriage like a bad Wi-Fi signal, uninvited, persistent, and somehow always there at the worst moments. At first, I didn't think much of it. Everyone's got that one overly invested manager who acts like the company's mission statement personally depends on your weekend plans. But Richard took dedicated to Olympic levels. The man texted her at 11 p.m. about font choices. Font choices. Who does that? It's urgent, Olivia, he'd say, like Helvetica was a matter of national security. And every time her phone buzzed, she'd glance at me with that quick, guilty look, the kind you give when you know you're about to say something stupid like, it's just work. Richard just values my input, she told me once, curling her hair before bed like she was preparing for a Zoom call in her sleep. Sure, I said. And mosquitoes just value your blood. She rolled her eyes. You're paranoid. Maybe. But paranoia is just intuition that's been burned before. Still, I let it slide. In marriage, you pick your battles, and I was saving my ammo. I told myself it was harmless. After all, she came home every night. We ate dinner together, watched bad Netflix documentaries about cults, and fell asleep to the hum of the ceiling fan. That's normal, right? People text their bosses late at night all the time. Happens in every marriage, right? Then came the first office party, or as I like to call it, the night of unnecessary sequence. Olivia had been buzzing about it all week, saying things like, it's just networking, and everyone's bringing their spouses. Which, in my experience, is code for, come watch me pretend we have the perfect marriage while we both die inside. The event was at this downtown hotel with valet parking, a red carpet entrance, and enough champagne to make HR nervous. Olivia looked stunning, red dress, perfect curls, that confidence that made her glow like she owned the building. I, on the other hand, was the human equivalent of a neutral accessory. Just a man in a suit, smiling and shaking hands, trying not to look like he was counting how many shrimp cocktails it would take to make the night worth it. Richard spotted us the moment we walked in. He was impossible to miss. Tall, silver hair styled within an inch of its life, wearing a suit so sharp it probably had its own insurance policy. Olivia, he called out, waving dramatically. You look incredible. Then his eyes slid over to me. And you must be Alex, the famous husband. The analyst, right? The one and only, I said, shaking his hand. He smiled that politician smile, the kind that says, I could charm your grandmother while foreclosing on her house. Lucky man, he said. She's the whole package. I smiled back, resisting the urge to say, and you're the whole red flag, sir. Instead, I nodded like an idiot. Yeah, I know. Richard wasn't just her boss. He was Mr. Perfect in Prada, the kind of guy who thought charisma was a skill and networking was a personality. He strutted around the ballroom like a walking motivational quote, greeting people with fake humility and a Rolex flash that could blind a small nation. I spent most of the night standing beside Olivia, watching as he praised her campaign results like she'd just solved world hunger through email marketing. Olivia's innovative approach to client retention is revolutionary, he said into the mic during his toast. Revolutionary. The woman found a better way to send coupons. Don't get me wrong, I was proud of her. I was also aware that Richard's admiration came with the subtle scent of cologne and midlife crisis. Every time he leaned in too close, my inner monologue started building spreadsheets of possible murder alibis. But I kept my composure. That's the thing about being the quiet guy. You learn how to weaponize patience. When the party ended, Olivia and I walked to the car, her heels clicking against the pavement like applause. "You were quiet tonight," she said, unlocking the door. "Just taking it all in," I replied. "Great party. Your boss really knows how to make a toast." She glanced at me. "Don't start." "Start what?" "You're reading into things again." I shrugged. "If by reading, you mean noticing your boss stared at you like a motivational poster, then yeah, guilty." She sighed, the kind of sigh that says, "You're being dramatic and I'm too tired for this." "It's just professional respect, Alex." "Respect, huh? That what they're calling it now? God, you're impossible sometimes." "Only sometimes," I said with a grin, trying to lighten the mood. She didn't laugh. The drive home was quiet except for the sound of her phone buzzing. I didn't look, but I didn't have to. Richard's name glowed like a neon sign in my peripheral vision. She typed something quickly, then locked the screen. "Just confirming the event recap," she muttered. "At midnight." "Deadlines, babe." "Sure. Because marketing emergencies totally happen at midnight on a Saturday." I wanted to say something. Anything. But the thing about red flags is, at first, they look pink under romantic lighting. You tell yourself it's fine. You tell yourself she loves you, that her loyalty isn't up for sale to a man who probably rehearses his compliments in the mirror. So I swallowed my instincts and convinced myself I was overreacting. It's easier to ignore a fire when it's still just smoke. Weeks went by. The texts continued. The late nights at the office became common enough that I started greeting her with, "Welcome home, part-time roommate." She didn't laugh at that one either. Our dinners became quieter, our smiles thinner. I caught her once smiling at her phone during breakfast, her face lighting up like a teenager reading a crush's text. "Who's that?" I asked casually. "Work stuff?" she said quickly, locking her phone. "You wouldn't get it." "You're right, Olivia. I wouldn't get why a grown man with a wife and a pension is sending you emojis at 7:30 a.m. Then came the night she didn't come home until 2. I'd called twice, no answer. Texted once, no reply. When she finally walked in, her makeup was faded, her perfume barely hanging on. "Sorry," she said, dropping her purse. "Last-minute presentation prep." "Presentation that needed wine?" I asked, noticing the faint smell. She froze. "It was a client dinner." "With Richard?" Her eyes flickered. "He's my boss." "Uh-huh. And I'm your husband." She threw up her hands. "You're being ridiculous." "Maybe. But it's amazing how often ridiculous turns into right in the sequel." We didn't talk much after that. I went to work, came home, and counted how many times she smiled at her phone versus at me. Spoiler, the phone was winning. One evening, I walked past her laptop and saw a message preview pop up from Richard. It read, "Couldn't have done tonight without you. You're amazing." I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Sometimes silence says enough. I poured myself a drink instead, sat on the couch, stared at the framed wedding photo on our mantle. The one where she's laughing, and I'm looking at her like she's the only person in the world. Maybe back then, she was. But right then, she looked like someone I was slowly losing to a man who thought leadership meant emotional trespassing. That's when it hit me. Maybe marriage wasn't about picking your battles. Maybe it was about realizing when you were fighting a war you didn't even sign up for. So I did what any sane man would do in a rom-com right before the plot twist. I smiled to myself, took another sip, and whispered, "Okay, Richard Hayes. Game on." Richard Hayes wasn't your average middle-aged boss. He was the human version of a LinkedIn motivational post. Leadership, vision, integrity, all while probably sending a "you up" text to someone who wasn't his wife. You know the type. Thinks synergy is an emotion and team spirit can be purchased with pizza. The man was tall, silver-haired, and had a wardrobe that screamed, "I pay more for my tie than you do for rent." I swear his cologne could file its own tax return. Every time he walked into a room, he made sure everyone knew it. He had that aura that said, "I own stock in confidence." And unfortunately, my wife was one of his biggest shareholders. Olivia would talk about him the way people talk about legends. "Richard's a visionary," she'd say. "He's changing the whole company culture." Sure, because nothing screams innovation like an executive who still calls female employees sweetheart. But she bought into it, all of it. She admired his drive, his focus, his mentorship. Meanwhile, I was over here trying not to gag every time his name came up in casual conversation. She'd be plating dinner and go, "Richard says presentation is everything." And I'd mutter, "So is character, but look how that's working out for him." Don't get me wrong, I wasn't insecure. I knew who I was, stable job, decent looks, 401k that didn't look like a bad joke. I was the guy who filed taxes early and remembered our anniversary. I wasn't flashy, but I was steady. The kind of man you build a life with, not the kind you build an HR complaint around. But Richard? He was temptation disguised as mentorship, an ego in a $3,000 suit. And Olivia, for all her intelligence, seemed blind to it. Or maybe she wasn't. Maybe she just liked the attention that came wrapped in corporate approval and designer cufflinks. The first time I met him outside that office party, it was at this stupid company brunch. Olivia called it a casual networking event. Translation: "You're coming with me so I can prove my husband isn't a myth." I put on my best, "I'm not threatened by your boss" face and tagged along. We arrived at this pretentious downtown cafe where avocado toast cost more than my car insurance. Richard was already there, of course, white button-down, sleeves rolled to show off a watch that probably had its own security detail. He stood up, smiled that smug, toothpaste commercial smile, and shook my hand like he was interviewing me for permission to date my wife. "Alex, my man," he said, as if we'd been golfing buddies for years. "I've heard so much about you." "Oh, I bet you have," I said, trying to keep the smile from cracking. He laughed, that loud, performative laugh bosses use when they're pretending to like you but are really thinking about bonuses. "You're in finance, right? Numbers guy." "Guilty." "Ah, love that. The backbone of every successful company. You and I, we're the same. Analytical, disciplined." I nodded. "Sure. Except I don't send people emails at 11 p.m. about PowerPoint transitions." Olivia shot me a warning glare, the kind that said, "Don't ruin this for me." Richard just chuckled. "Huh. You've got a sense of humor, Alex. I like that." "Oh, I bet you do." The brunch went about as well as you'd expect. Richard dominated the conversation like a man trying to win an Oscar for most self-important human alive. He talked about his vision for the company, his revolutionary leadership style, his passion for mentoring young talent, which, by the way, was corporate code for "I take too much credit for other people's work." Every few minutes, he'd turn to Olivia and compliment her like she was an award he'd won. "Olivia, your campaign last quarter was outstanding. You have that spark," he said, touching his chest dramatically like he'd just witnessed art. "I always tell my team, surround yourself with people smarter than you." Then, with a smirk, which means I did something right hiring her, I smiled. "Oh, definitely. You've got great instincts. I mean, 3 marriages can't all be flukes." The table went silent. Richard's smile flickered for half a second before he recovered. "Ah, well," he said, forcing a laugh. "I suppose that's one way to look at experience." Olivia kicked me under the table so hard my soul left my body. I took a sip of my coffee and said nothing. I was calm. I was zen. I was also mentally digging a grave with his name on it. After brunch, Olivia unleashed on me the second we got into the car. "What the hell was that?" she snapped. "What was what?" "You humiliated him." "Sweetheart," I said calmly. "He's a grown man with 3 divorces and a company therapist. I think he can handle a joke." It wasn't funny. Neither is him calling you at midnight. But here we are. She groaned, exasperated. "You're jealous." That word. That cursed word. The one that turns every rational concern into an emotional tantrum. "Jealous?" I said, laughing. "No, Olivia. Jealous is when I see someone else get the last piece of cheesecake. This is observation. There's a difference." She crossed her arms and stared out the window. "You're impossible." "And yet," I said, "you married me." Wild, right? The silence that followed could have frozen lava. The next few days were weird. She was distant. I tried to make small talk. She kept things strictly work update level. It was like living with a polite stranger who occasionally borrowed my toothpaste. But I didn't push. I'd learned something about Olivia. If you confront her too early, she doubles down. If you wait, the guilt starts to eat her alive. Patience, in my experience, is the ultimate weapon. A week later, she invited me to another company function, Richard's team celebration dinner. Apparently, their department had landed a major client. You should come, she said. Richard insists. I smiled. Oh, he insists? Then how could I say no? The dinner was held at a private dining room in a fancy steakhouse. The kind of place where the napkins have their own zip code. Richard was, predictably, the loudest one there. He stood up for a toast, glass of red wine in hand. To success, he boomed. And to Olivia, who's been the shining star of this entire campaign. Everyone clapped. I raised my glass too. Then he looked at me, right at me, and said, Alex, you're a lucky man. It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. Like he was announcing that he'd personally approved my existence. You're lucky, he continued, smirking. She's the whole package. I grinned back, my voice sugar-coated poison. Yeah, I know. Though it's funny. You say that like you've been trying to test the packaging yourself. Laughter exploded around the table, awkward and nervous. Richard blinked, smile faltering just enough to show I'd hit the mark. You're a funny guy, Alex. Comes with the math degree, I said. Keeps me sane. Olivia whispered, please stop, through clenched teeth. But oh, I was just getting started. You see, sarcasm is like bourbon, best served smooth and slow. I wasn't mad, not yet. I was collecting data, observing patterns, like a man building a case file. And everything about Richard screamed pattern. The unnecessary late-night calls. The over-the-top praise. The subtle digs at me disguised as banter. It was all there, and Olivia, for some reason, couldn't, or wouldn't, see it. After dinner, Richard approached me by the bar. Hey, he said, clapping me on the shoulder like we were fraternity brothers. Listen, I hope I didn't cross any lines earlier. Lines? I asked innocently. No, of course not. You seem like a man who ignores boundaries professionally and personally. He chuckled nervously. You're a sharp one. Olivia's lucky to have someone who keeps her grounded. Yeah, I said, taking a sip of my drink. And you're lucky HR doesn't have hidden cameras. He froze for a beat, then forced a laugh. You've got jokes, man. You should work in marketing. Nah, I said, smiling. Too many clowns. The drive home that night was silent again. Olivia was tense, probably rehearsing her TED Talk titled How My Husband Embarrassed My Boss and Ruined My Career Prospects. But I wasn't sorry. Someone had to draw a line. And if she wasn't going to, well, I was damn good at drawing lines. Comes with the analyst territory. When we got home, she finally spoke. You can't keep doing that, Alex. Doing what? Breathing near your boss. He's important to me. And I used to be. Remember those days? She glared. You're twisting things. No, Liv. I'm just reading the chart. And according to the data, Richard's trending upward, and I'm being phased out like an old software update. She shook her head, muttering something about needing space, and disappeared into the bedroom. I stayed on the couch, staring at the ceiling fan spinning in lazy circles, wondering when marriage turned into a board meeting I didn't remember scheduling. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing Richard's smug laugh, his words echoing like a bad ad slogan. You're a lucky man. Maybe I was. Lucky to see the red flags before they became permanent fixtures. Lucky to realize that sometimes the biggest threats to your marriage wear designer suits and call it mentorship. By morning, I'd made a decision. If Richard Hayes wanted to play games, I'd play too. Only difference? I knew how to calculate the odds, and I never bet on a man who thinks professionalism ends at the dinner table. If hell had a catering budget, it would look exactly like Richard Hayes's client appreciation dinner. The name alone sounded innocent. Grateful executives, polite applause, maybe a raffle for a company mug, but in reality, it was a brag fest with appetizers. Olivia called it networking. I called it emotional waterboarding with steak. She'd been giddy about it all week, insisting we go. It'll be fun, she said. Everyone's bringing their partners. Which I later learned translates to. You'll stand next to me like furniture while people pretend to like you. We arrived at the Meridian, a restaurant so expensive even the valet looked judgmental. The kind of place where the lighting was dim enough to hide regret, but bright enough to showcase your insecurity. I walked in wearing my navy suit. Nothing flashy, just classic. Olivia? She looked like she'd walked out of a Vogue cover shoot. Her dress was sleek, her smile sharper than the steak knives. She was radiant in a way that made me feel both proud and uneasy. And when I saw Richard's face light up like a man watching a limited edition sports car roll past, I knew my instincts were clocking overtime. He stood there, glass of wine in hand, with that trademark, I'm everyone's boss and best friend, grin plastered across his face. Olivia, he said, his voice smooth like he'd been practicing charm in the mirror. You look like success itself. I chuckled softly. And here I thought success was supposed to be rare. He turned to me, eyebrows raised like he'd just spotted an unpaid intern. And you must be the lucky accountant who gets to watch success every day. I forced a smile. Financial analyst, actually. But sure, lucky fits. Especially when success doesn't text me after midnight about presentation slides. A few people overheard. One choked on their champagne. Olivia shot me that, please behave, look married people develop by year 2. Richard smirked. You're a funny guy, Alex. Yeah, I said. It's either laugh or drink heavily. The waiter arrived just in time to save us both from homicide. He poured wine like he was baptizing the table, and everyone started settling in. The company bigwigs were there, executives, partners, clients who looked like they'd been waiting their whole lives to talk about golf. I could already tell I was outnumbered. Half the men were wearing watches that cost more than my student loans, and the women had smiles that said, I've been nodding at these conversations for years. We took our seats. I was wedged between a junior marketing associate who kept nervously refreshing her phone and a client who introduced himself as Todd from Cincinnati and proceeded to tell me about his Tesla for 20 minutes straight. Olivia sat directly across from me, right beside Richard, because of course she did. Strategic seating, she'd explained earlier. He wants key people near the clients. Yeah, and apparently, my wife's shoulder was the best icebreaker. Dinner started off civilized enough. Small talk, laughter, fake compliments, and lobster tails that looked too perfect to be trusted. I sipped my wine, smiled at the appropriate moments, and counted how many times Richard found excuses to touch Olivia's arm. By the 4th accidental brush, I started wondering if I could write this off as a business expense for emotional labor. Then came the toasts. Richard stood up, raising his glass like he was about to announce world peace. Tonight, he said, we celebrate not just success, but excellence. This team has shown dedication, creativity, and above all, passion. His gaze landed on Olivia like a spotlight, and none more so than Olivia Grant. Her work ethic, her brilliance, it's truly inspiring. She's the heartbeat of this campaign. Applause echoed around the room. I clapped too, because what else could I do? But I noticed something in her smile, something practiced. She looked proud, yes, but also like she knew the praise came with fine print. Richard turned to me next. And of course, he said, chuckling, we can't forget the man who supports her from behind the scenes. You're a lucky guy, Alex. She's the whole package. I raised my glass and smiled. I know, though I'm starting to think the package comes with a subscription fee. A few people laughed quietly, mostly those who didn't depend on Richard for a paycheck. His jaw tightened, but he covered it with another laugh. You've got a sharp tongue, my friend. Just good observation skills, I said. Helps in finance. And marriage. Olivia's eyes flashed warning. The silent plea was loud. Don't do this here. I nodded like I'd behave. Spoiler, I wouldn't. The next hour dragged on like a bad sitcom. People bragged about profits, trips, team synergy, and other meaningless corporate buzzwords. I nodded through all of it, occasionally chiming in with gems like fascinating or wow, impressive, which, translated, meant please stop talking. At one point, Richard leaned in close to Olivia and whispered something that made her laugh, softly, delicately, like a secret shared. My grip on the wine glass tightened. I wasn't jealous. I was observant. There's a difference. And what I was observing was a man enjoying himself a little too much with someone else's wife. Then he did it. The moment that turned the night from awkward to unforgettable. He leaned back in his chair, clearly 3 glasses deep into ego, and said, You know, Olivia could do way better than you, Alex. Forks paused midair. Conversations died mid-sentence. You could hear the sound of collective discomfort settling over the table like dust. Olivia gasped softly, eyes wide. Richard smirked, confident in his own untouchable status. You're a good man, he continued, but not her level. No offense. I set down my glass slowly, smiled the way you do when you've already decided to burn everything down, and said, Richard, I think you're right. He blinked. I am. Absolutely. I said, leaning back casually. You'd know all about people doing better. You've been married 3 times. You've had the most practice. Laughter burst out before anyone could stop it. The junior associate nearly spit out her drink. One of the clients coughed into his napkin to hide a grin. Richard's face turned the color of his Cabernet. He stammered. Now that's not very professional. Professional? I interrupted, feigning surprise. You called your last secretary honey in a board meeting, didn't you? HR loved that one. I heard it's still trending. Olivia's face was pale. Alex, stop. But I wasn't angry. I was calm, too calm. There's a certain kind of serenity that comes when you realize you have nothing left to lose. The kind that turns every word into a weapon wrapped in charm. Relax, Richard, I said, grinning. We're just having fun, right? You like to push boundaries. I'm just exploring them with you. He tried to laugh it off, but his hands trembled slightly. The room was dead silent now. Even the waiter had vanished into the safety of the kitchen. I leaned forward, lowering my voice just enough to make everyone lean in. Tell me, Richard, what exactly does better look like to you? Someone who works weekends and calls it passion? Someone who spends $3,000 on a suit but forgets his anniversary? Or maybe someone who calls his Tesla a reward for leadership but can't reverse park without the intern guiding him? Laughter rippled through the crowd again, louder this time. Even the CEO cracked a restrained smile behind his glass. Richard looked like he was one PowerPoint slide away from a breakdown. Here's to better, Richard, I said, lifting my glass. May you find it before your next divorce. That sealed it. The table erupted. A few people clapped. Others pretended to suddenly remember their side dishes. Richard's jaw clenched so tight, I thought his veneers might file for workers' comp. Olivia looked mortified. Alex, that was uncalled for, she whispered. I smiled, still calm, still in control. Maybe, but damn, it felt necessary. The rest of dinner was a blur. Richard avoided eye contact. The CEO politely shifted topics to quarterly earnings, and the tension could have been sliced thinner than the steak. I just sat there, sipping my wine, feeling strangely liberated. For years, I'd played the quiet, agreeable husband, the man who kept the peace while his wife's career soared. But tonight, I'd stepped off the sidelines. Tonight, I reminded everyone, including Olivia, that silence wasn't the same as weakness. When dessert arrived, some overpriced mousse pretending to be art, Richard stood abruptly. If you'll excuse me, he said, voice tight. I have an early flight. Translation, I need to salvage my dignity before it dissolves. As he walked out, I raised my glass again. Safe travels, boss. Don't forget to expense the therapy. Laughter followed him all the way out. By the time we left, Olivia wasn't speaking to me. Her heels clicked furiously against the floor, every step screaming, we'll talk about this later. I didn't mind. Talking later was her favorite form of denial. I opened the car door for her like a gentleman, because if you're going to burn bridges, you might as well do it politely. The ride home was silent, except for her shallow breathing and the distant hum of the engine. I looked out the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks of gold and red. My mind was oddly clear. Somewhere between Richard's insult and my toast, something inside me shifted. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was self-respect finally crawling out of hibernation. Either way, I knew one thing for sure. The next morning, things wouldn't go back to normal. They never do after the first explosion. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of silence. The married kind of silence that feels like a hostage negotiation in progress. Olivia wasn't in bed. Her side was neatly made, the way hotel staff tuck corners when they're mad at you for existing. I walked into the kitchen to find her already dressed for work, sipping coffee like it was keeping her dignity alive. She didn't look up when she said, I can't believe you humiliated me like that last night. Good morning to you too, I said, pouring my own cup. She turned, jaw tight. Do you even realize what you did? I nodded. Yeah. I turned dinner into a TED talk about boundaries. You're welcome. Alex, you embarrassed my boss in front of clients. I smirked. Technically, he embarrassed himself. I just provided commentary. She set her cup down hard enough to make it tremble. He was joking. Oh, so when he says you could do better, that's just workplace humor? Guess I missed the HR memo about emotional affairs being team-building activities. She glared. That's not what this is, isn't it? I asked, because it sure looked like a man marking territory that doesn't belong to him. That stopped her for a moment. Her voice dropped. You're paranoid, Alex. I laughed softly. And you're defending a man who insults your husband in public. So I guess we're even. She grabbed her purse and stormed out, muttering something about me being childish. I watched her go, calm as ever. See, here's the thing. Once you stop fearing the fallout, it's amazing how peaceful nuclear war can feel. That evening, she came home later than usual. Her lipstick was faded, her eyes tired, her mood somewhere between exhausted and furious. Richard wants to talk to you, she said. Oh, about what? My comedic timing. This isn't funny, she snapped. He said he wants to clear the air. I leaned back on the couch. He's welcome to try, but I charge for therapy sessions. I'm serious, Alex. He's inviting us to another dinner. Just us three. Oh, perfect, I said. A sequel. Maybe this time he can insult me before dessert. She folded her arms. Please, just behave. I need this job. That hit differently. I need this job. Not we, I looked at her and realized we weren't exactly on the same team anymore. But fine, I agreed. Not because I cared what Richard thought, but because part of me wanted to see just how deep this rabbit hole went. The next evening, I found myself walking into yet another upscale restaurant, the kind where menus don't have prices because if you have to ask, you can't afford to sit down. Richard was already there, standing near the table with his trademark smirk and a glass of red wine that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. Alex, he said, extending his hand. Glad you could make it. I shook it. Firmly. Wouldn't miss it for the world. I needed closure and entertainment. He chuckled, pretending to take the high road. Let's start fresh, shall we? Sure, I said, sliding into my chair. But let's use actual silverware this time, not sarcasm disguised as compliments. He hesitated. Olivia gave me a warning glance. Richard just wants to apologize. He nodded, putting on his best PR damage control face. I may have taken things too far at the last dinner. It was inappropriate, and I'm sorry. I stared at him for a moment, then smiled. Apology accepted. Though you might want to practice that speech. HR loves that kind of sincerity. Olivia sighed audibly. Can we please have one dinner without you turning it into stand-up comedy? I'm trying, I said. But the material just keeps writing itself. For the first 10 minutes, the tension could have been cut with a butter knife. Richard was polite, overly polite, asking about my work, my hobbies, my insights into finance. You know, all the things people pretend to care about before circling back to the topic they actually want to discuss. Then he leaned back, swirled his wine, and said it. You know, Alex, I just want you to understand. Olivia's got real potential. I see something in her. Oh, I'm sure you do, I said. He smiled faintly. I mean professionally. Of course, I said, nodding. Because nothing says professional like 11 p.m. PowerPoint emergencies. Olivia gasped softly. Alex, but I wasn't done. Let me ask you something, Richard. When you text her late at night, is that strategy session before or after your wife goes to bed? He froze, wine glass halfway to his lips. Excuse me. You heard me, I said, calm as a saint at confession. You keep saying it's work, but I don't recall inappropriate timing being part of the job description. His face reddened. That's not what's happening. Of course not, I said. You're a mentor, and she's just lucky to have your guidance. Lucky's the word you like, right? He blinked, realizing I'd quoted him from the last dinner. This isn't productive. Neither is flirting with employees, but here we are. Olivia slammed her fork down. Enough. Both of you. You're acting like children. I turned to her. I'm not the one who brought a man home in her phone, Olivia. Her eyes went wide. That's not fair. Neither was that comment he made in front of everyone. But you didn't defend me then, did you? She fell silent. Richard tried to speak, but I raised a hand. No, you stay out of this. You've already said enough in your 3 divorces to fill a courtroom. For a long moment, nobody said a word. Then, unbelievably, Richard laughed. You've got guts, I'll give you that. Thanks, I said. They come in handy when I'm dealing with parasites. He leaned forward, his composure cracking. You know what your problem is, Alex? You're threatened by your wife's success. You can't stand that she's outgrown you. Olivia's breath caught. He'd said the quiet part out loud. I laughed, a deep, calm, dangerous laugh. You think this is about success? No, Richard. This is about respect. Something you seem to have misplaced between your affairs and your self-promotion. I stood up, adjusting my jacket. But you're right about one thing. She has outgrown something. Just not me. Olivia's eyes darted between us, panic creeping in. Alex, please don't. But I was already done. I leaned on the table, looked Richard dead in the eye, and said, "You ever talk about my marriage again, I'll make sure your next job title is unemployed. And trust me, your reputation won't survive the PowerPoint I'll make about you." He opened his mouth, then closed it, because for once, the man who always had something to say didn't. I dropped a few bills on the table, looked at Olivia, and said, "Enjoy your meal. It's on me. Consider it my last investment in this circus." Then I walked out. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could already imagine the chaos I left behind. Richard's red face, Olivia's stunned silence, the waiter pretending not to have opinions. I walked through the restaurant lobby, past the polished mirrors and overpriced artwork, feeling something I hadn't felt in months: peace. Outside, the night air hit me like a baptism. Cool, clean, honest. I took a deep breath and smiled to myself. Richard thought he'd embarrassed me. What they didn't realize was that I'd just switched strategies. If they wanted drama, they could keep it. I was moving to data. The next day, I went to work early, 6 a.m., my favorite hour, when the office smells like burnt coffee and regret. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and started pulling threads. You see, finance teaches you to spot patterns. Numbers never lie, but people? They write entire fiction novels and spreadsheets. I checked corporate filings, expense reports, and travel reimbursements. Nothing illegal, but plenty interesting. Richard's client dinners happened suspiciously often at the same restaurant, the same nights Olivia worked late. Cute. By noon, I'd compiled a dossier so organized it could have testified in court. Still, this wasn't about exposure. Not yet. I wanted to understand how deep his stupidity ran, and how far Olivia was willing to defend it. That evening, she came home exhausted, eyes puffy like she'd been crying or pretending not to. She tossed her heels on the rug and sighed. "Rough day," she murmured. "Oh yeah," I said casually, not looking up from my laptop. "What happened? Printer jam or moral dilemma?" She froze. "Don't start." I smiled. "I didn't. Richard did. I'm just reading the minutes." "Alex," she warned, "please. He's still my boss." I raised an eyebrow. "For now." She frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" I closed the laptop slowly, savoring the moment. "It means people who mistake charm for competence usually get replaced by people who don't." "Are you threatening him?" she asked, half shocked, half intrigued, the same tone. "Someone might use if they caught you looking confident for the first time in years." "Threatening?" I chuckled. "No, just predicting market correction." Friday came faster than gossip, and with it, Richard's grand company luncheon, a casual buffet, to celebrate their recent project launch. I wasn't invited, obviously, but fate and curiosity are nosy roommates. Olivia left early, dressed to kill in corporate chic. I waited 30 minutes, then put on a suit of my own and headed downtown. When I walked into the hotel ballroom, no one stopped me. I looked like I belonged. Confidence is the best security badge. The place was everything you'd expect: a sea of name tags, overpriced appetizers, and laughter that sounded like people trying too hard to prove they were important. Richard stood near the carving station, holding court like a dictator of mediocre ideas. "Alex," he said when he finally noticed me, voice pitched somewhere between surprise and fear. "Didn't know you'd be joining us." I smiled. Neither did HR. He laughed nervously. "Here for Olivia, I assume?" "Partly. Mostly for the food." I grabbed a plate and started loading it like I was preparing for hibernation. "Never pass up free steak. Company might not be around next quarter." His smile faltered. "Excuse me." "Relax," I said, slicing into the meat. "Just making conversation." Olivia appeared beside him, her smile strained enough to crack. "Alex, can we talk?" "Sure," I said, "but I'm mid-experiment. Seeing how long I can eat in peace before someone calls security." Richard cleared his throat. "Maybe we should keep things civil." "Funny," I said. "That's exactly what your HR policy says, right under the section about inappropriate comments at work events." The crowd around us began to notice. People love tension more than dessert. I set down my fork, dabbed my mouth with a napkin, and leaned back like an attorney approaching the witness stand. "Tell me, Richard," I said conversationally, "what does better look like? Someone who works weekends and calls it passion? Someone who spends $3,000 on a suit but forgets his mortgage payment?" Laughter rippled through the group. Richard's face reddened. "You think this is funny?" Actually, yeah, I said. It's hilarious. Especially considering you call your Tesla a reward for leadership, but can't reverse park without the intern guiding you. A few chuckles escaped. Even the CEO, standing across the room, pretended to cough into his drink. Richard looked around, realizing control was slipping. You're way out of line, Alex. Out of line, I echoed. Coming from the man who once emailed a junior associate at midnight with, and I quote, "We need to talk about your dress presentation." A collective gasp. I shrugged. Public records, man. Delete faster next time. Olivia whispered furiously, "Stop it." But I wasn't angry. Anger was for amateurs. I was deliberate. Every word measured. Every punch disguised as politeness. "See, Richard," I continued, "you told my wife she could do better. You implied I'm not her level. And you're right, I'm not. My level involves honesty, stability, and not needing interns to inflate my ego." He snapped. "You have no idea what it takes to run a company." "Oh, I do," I said, smiling. "It's just that where I come from, leadership isn't measured by how many people laugh at your jokes out of fear." The room was silent now. The buffet line had stopped moving. Even the shrimp cocktail looked uncomfortable. Olivia grabbed my arm. "We're leaving." "Not yet," I said gently. "I'm almost done." I turned back to Richard. "Here's to better, remember? May you find it before your next divorce." Half the room laughed. Half pretended not to. Someone clapped. I raised my glass of water, couldn't risk red wine on my suit, and toasted. To professionalism. Richard's lips pressed into a line so tight you could have used it to cut glass. He set his drink down and muttered, "This conversation's over." "Agreed," I said cheerfully. "I've had my fill, and the buffet's better company anyway." We left the ballroom to a murmur of whispers and suppressed laughter. Olivia didn't speak until we reached the parking lot. "What the hell was that?" "An exit interview," I said. "You humiliated him again." "No," I said, unlocking the car. "He humiliated himself. I just brought the PowerPoint." She crossed her arms. "You're ruining my career." "No, Olivia. I'm saving your reputation. There's a difference." She laughed bitterly. "By turning me into gossip? By reminding people your husband's not a doormat," I said. "You keep forgetting that matters too." She shook her head, tears glinting in her eyes. "You've changed." I smiled sadly. "No, I just stopped apologizing for noticing red flags." The drive home was quiet. The kind of quiet that fills every corner of a car until even the GPS feels awkward. I parked in the driveway, turned off the engine, and sat there. She stared out the window like the glass might offer her an escape route. Finally, she whispered, "I didn't ask for this war." "Neither did I said. "But your boss started it when he decided my marriage was a networking opportunity." She turned toward me, voice breaking. "You think I wanted him to say those things? To look at me like that?" I looked at her, really looked at her. The exhaustion, the guilt, the faint sadness hiding behind defiance. "No," I said softly. "I think you wanted someone to make you feel seen again. And I get that. I just wish it hadn't been him." For a moment, she said nothing. Then she whispered, "What now?" "Now," I said, stepping out of the car, "I go inside, eat leftovers, and sleep like a man who's finally done pretending." Inside, I sat at the kitchen table, the same place where we'd once planned vacations and dreamed about a house with a backyard. Now it felt like a courtroom, memories on one side, reality on the other. I opened my laptop again, stared at Richard's expense reports one last time, then closed it. I didn't need more evidence. Truth had already shown up, uninvited and undeniable. The next morning, Olivia tried to make small talk over breakfast. "You working from home today?" "Yeah," I said, buttering toast. "It's quieter when no one's lying." She didn't respond. I spent the day pretending to focus on spreadsheets, but really, I was drafting something else. The speech I'd give when this marriage inevitably hit its final audit. Every relationship has an inventory day when you tally what's left and what's lost. Turns out ours had a deficit labeled trust. That evening, she came into my office, eyes red. Richard called me in. The CEO heard what happened. "There's talk of a review." "Good," I said. "Maybe they'll finally review his character." "This isn't a joke." "I'm not laughing," I said quietly. "But maybe karma is." She started crying. Real tears this time, not performative ones. "I just wanted you to support me." "I did," I said. "Until supporting you meant applauding him." She sank into the chair opposite me, defeated. I don't know what to do anymore. I sighed, leaning back. Then don't. Let life do it for you. That night, while she slept restlessly in the next room, I packed a small, overnight bag. Nothing dramatic, just the essentials: clothes, wallet, self-respect. I wasn't running away. I was stepping back. Distance, after all, is the best magnifier of truth. Before leaving, I scribbled a note on the kitchen counter. You said I embarrassed you. Maybe. But I'd rather be the man who embarrassed a liar than the man who tolerated one. Then I walked out. The night air felt different, colder, clearer, freer. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was losing. I felt like I was finally testifying. There's something oddly peaceful about the moment you realize a relationship has hit the expiration date. Like finding spoiled milk in the fridge, you're disgusted, sure, but also relieved you finally know what that smell was. For me, that realization came wrapped in a designer napkin at a restaurant with overpriced water and undercooked sincerity. After the buffet incident, Olivia and I didn't talk for 2 straight days. She left early for work, came home late, and avoided eye contact like it was a tax audit. I didn't chase her. I wasn't the chasing type anymore. I was the man who'd learned the fine art of waiting for the right words, the right moment, or, in this case, the final straw. It arrived Saturday night, gift-wrapped in tension. She asked if we could meet for dinner to talk. That phrase, to talk, should be listed as a controlled substance. It's never good news. Nobody says to talk when they're planning a surprise vacation. I put on my black suit, the one I wore when I wanted to remind people I could look like a man who had his life together, and met her at a restaurant called Verve, because pretentious names are mandatory when love's about to die. She was already there when I walked in. Hair flawless, makeup perfect, face unreadable. She'd chosen a corner table, of course. Private. Strategic. The kind of table people pick when they're about to break your heart, but still want dessert. I sat down across from her and smiled. So, are we celebrating the end of my reputation, or just getting ahead of next week's scandal? She didn't laugh. Alex, don't do that. Do what? Turn everything into a joke. Oh, sorry, I said, waving at the waiter. I'll order some seriousness with my steak. She sighed. This isn't funny. You made me look bad. I nodded slowly. And you made me look invisible. I guess we're even. Her eyes flashed. You humiliated my boss. Who humiliated me first? Funny how your moral compass only spins when his name's on the map. Her lips tightened. Richard was out of line. Yes, but you didn't have to destroy his career over it. Destroy? I chuckled. Sweetheart, I told a few truths in a public setting. The man self-destructed. I just lit the match. She shook her head, disbelief mixing with something else. Fear, maybe. You're so calm about this. Calm, I said, smiling faintly. That's not calm. That's clarity. The waiter came, asked if we were ready to order. Olivia waved him off. Give us a few minutes. Then she leaned in, eyes cold. You need to apologize to him. For a second, I thought she was joking. Then I saw her expression, the kind that made HR departments nervous. I laughed, quietly, like someone told a bad joke. You're serious? Yes. You went too far, Alex. You made things worse for everyone. You embarrassed me in front of my colleagues, my friends. Friends who laughed when your boss told you could do better? I asked. Those friends. You don't understand how corporate culture works. Oh, I understand perfectly. You kiss up, you cover for incompetence, and when the smoke clears, you blame the honest guy for pointing at the fire. Stop twisting this. I'm not twisting it, Olivia. I'm just refusing to gaslight myself. She pushed her plate away and crossed her arms. Apologize, Alex. Tonight. Call him. Make it right. I stared at her for a long moment, then set my napkin down. You know, for years, I thought the problem was communication. Turns out it's comprehension. Her voice dropped to a whisper. If you don't, we're over. There it was, the ultimatum. Delivered like a verdict, sharp and heavy. The restaurant noise faded, and all I could hear was the faint hum of betrayal. I should have been angry. I should have argued. But all I felt was done. Like a man watching a movie he's already seen 3 times and finally deciding to walk out before the credits. I took a slow sip of my water, then smiled. You know what's funny, Olivia? For years, I've been saving ammo, biting my tongue, playing the quiet husband. But tonight, I think I'm all out of reasons to keep pretending. She frowned. What does that mean? It means, I said softly, I'm not apologizing to a man who doesn't know the difference between leadership and lust. Her voice rose. You're impossible, and you're loyal to the wrong people. Say it, she demanded. Say you're sorry, or we're done. I leaned forward, eyes steady. Then I guess we're done. The silence that followed was brutal, beautiful, freeing. She blinked, stunned. You're really doing this? I'm not doing anything, I said, standing. You gave me a choice. I just picked the one that doesn't involve self-respect on clearance. She stood too, voice trembling with anger. Don't walk away from me, Alex. I'm not walking away, I said calmly, adjusting my jacket. I'm stepping back so you can see what you've become. Her breath hitched. You'll regret this. I smiled, genuinely this time. Maybe, but at least I'll do it from a comfortable distance. The waiter, poor soul, appeared again, oblivious to the nuclear fallout happening at table 7. Would you two care for dessert? I looked at him, then at her. Yeah, I said. Bring her something sweet. She's going to need it. Then I turned and walked out. The air outside was cool, sharp, honest. No perfume, no pretense. I loosened my tie, exhaled, and laughed quietly to myself. For once, I wasn't angry. I wasn't heartbroken. I was just done. Done pretending the problem was solvable. Done apologizing for calling out disrespect. Done fighting battles in a war I never declared. As I walked down the street, my phone buzzed. A message from Olivia. Don't do this. We can fix it. I typed back. We can't fix what you refuse to see. Then I blocked the number, not out of spite, but mercy. For both of us. I ended up at a late-night diner. Greasy tables, fluorescent lights, and the best pancakes in the city. The waitress poured me coffee and smiled. Rough night. I grinned. You could say that. My marriage just filed for early retirement. She laughed. Congrats or condolences? Still deciding. I ate my pancakes, scrolling through old photos on my phone. Us at the lake. Us at her sister's wedding. Us pretending everything was fine. Funny how every smile looks different in hindsight. I wasn't sad anymore. Nostalgic, maybe, but not sad. There's a difference between losing something and realizing it's already been gone for a while. When I got home, the house was dark. Her car wasn't in the driveway. On the kitchen counter, she'd left her ring. It was placed neatly beside my coffee mug, like a final signature on a silent contract. No note, no explanation, just the glint of metal and a shadow of what used to be love. I picked it up, held it to the light, and smiled. You were right, Richard, I muttered. She could do better. And so could I. I set the ring down and poured myself a drink. Whiskey, neat, because this wasn't a night for mixers or hesitation. As the burn hit my throat, I felt something loosen inside me. Not relief, not pride, just release. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of nothing, and it was glorious. No phone buzzing, no whispered apologies, no pretending, just peace. I made breakfast for one, cleaned the kitchen, and started deleting photos. It wasn't bitterness, it was inventory. Every picture I erased felt like reclaiming square footage in my own head. By noon, I packed a bag. Not because I needed to leave, but because I wanted to move forward. The world suddenly felt wide again. Like maybe, just maybe, the chapter after this one didn't have to be tragic. It could be honest. As I locked the door, I whispered to myself, Richard Hayes can keep his arrogance. Olivia can keep her excuses, and I'll keep my dignity. Fair trade. And for the first time in years, that actually felt like winning. There's a certain power in disappearing. Not the dramatic, movie-style kind with fake passports and burner phones, but the quiet, strategic kind where you pull the plug on every line people use to drain your sanity. For 2 weeks, I went ghost mode. No texts, no calls, no emails. I was a deleted contact with a pulse. Olivia probably thought I was sulking somewhere, nursing my pride and waiting for her to come back with an apology reheated in guilt. Cute theory. The truth? I was rebuilding, not my heart, but my exit plan. I'd always believed in the art of graceful revenge. You don't storm the castle, you buy it, renovate it, and evict the king. Olivia didn't know it yet, but I'd been quietly preparing my financial independence long before our marriage started wheezing. Call it intuition or call it trauma prevention, but I'd set aside a separate savings account in my name, funded through overtime projects and consulting gigs she never bothered to ask about. I told her it was just side money for emergencies. Turns out, betrayal qualifies. So, While she was likely pacing her apartment rehearsing apologies or new excuses, I was busy drafting my exit strategy like a CFO prepping a hostile takeover. The first step was money, the oxygen of any good vanishing act. Our joint savings? Half of that technically belonged to me, but here's where being the numbers guy paid off. I'd handled most of our banking, which meant I knew exactly which accounts were joined in name only and which ones were fair game. One quick transfer later, my separate account became a little heavier, and her business class credit card became a lot quieter. The next step was location. I didn't want to run. Running implies guilt. I wanted to relocate strategically. So I booked a furnished apartment downtown under an LLC I'd set up a year ago for freelance finance consulting. Pro tip, always have an LLC. It's like a prenup, but smarter. The lease was clean, the utilities prepaid, and the address private. While she was playing damage control at work, probably convincing HR that I was just emotionally unstable, I was sipping black coffee in my new apartment, watching the morning news, and smiling every time her boss's name flashed across the ticker. Because, oh yes, I'd made one very polite phone call before disappearing. His name was Mr. Greer, board liaison and company gatekeeper. I'd found his contact buried in a press release 6 months ago. A small, forgettable name to most, but gold to me. I told him I wanted to report a pattern of inappropriate conduct involving the marketing director, Richard Hayes, at company functions. I made it sound hesitant, almost reluctant, the voice of a man who didn't want trouble, just decency. I didn't even have to lie. Every word was true. The dinner, the comments, the late-night messages, all documented, all recorded. You'd be amazed how often people forget that always-on mics exist on modern phones. I sent him a few anonymous audio files and screenshots. Nothing damning on Olivia's part, just enough to prove Richard's ego had finally outpaced his intelligence. Mr. Greer thanked me for my concern for the company's reputation. By the time I hung up, I'd given them the rope. Whether they used it was up to them. Spoiler, they did. A week later, the corporate gossip mill started churning. A little bird from LinkedIn whispered that Richard was taking an indefinite leave of absence. Translation, fired but allowed to pack slowly. The board launched an internal review, and HR sent out those awkward values and workplace ethics memos that mean someone important just got caught being stupid. When I heard the news, I didn't celebrate. I didn't toast or dance or post vague quotes about karma. I just smiled, quietly, and kept reading. Because that's the thing about real revenge, it's not about victory. It's about closure. 2 days after the story broke, Olivia showed up at my door. I'd almost expected it. Heartbreak has a schedule. She stood there looking like a motivational poster that had been left out in the rain. Hair frizzy, mascara smudged, eyes red. She wore one of those soft beige sweaters she always used when she wanted to look approachable. It worked on strangers. "Alex," she said softly, "we need to talk." I leaned against the doorframe. "We've been needing to talk for 3 years. Now you want to start." She swallowed hard. "Please, just 5 minutes." I stepped aside. "Sure. You've had longer to lie, so 5 minutes feels merciful." She walked in, glancing around the apartment. "You moved fast." "Yeah," I said. "Turns out betrayal is a great productivity booster." She turned to me, desperate. "I made a mistake, okay? I overreacted. I shouldn't have given you that ultimatum." I crossed my arms. "You mean the one where I had to apologize to your boss or lose my marriage?" "Yeah, I remember. Real romantic." Her lip trembled. "He was fired, Alex. The board launched an investigation. They think I leaked it." I widened my eyes, feigning shock. "Oh no, that's terrible. Who would do such a thing?" "Stop," she said, tears forming. "Please, stop." I sighed, sitting on the edge of the table. "You know, Liv, for someone who claimed to be such a good judge of character, you sure surrounded yourself with fools." She sat down, face in her hands. "I lost my job. They said I should have reported him sooner. They're investigating my emails. Everything's falling apart." "Ah," I said, nodding. "So you finally know what it's like to be publicly humiliated. Welcome to the club." Her voice cracked. "You think this makes us even? Even?" I leaned forward. "No. You embarrassed me in front of a dozen people. He insulted me in front of a room full of clients. But I made sure both of you answered to something bigger than me. Consequence." She stared at me, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You're not the man I married." "Good," I said quietly. He was too patient. For a while, she just sat there, crying silently. Then she whispered, "Can't we fix this? We built a life together." I laughed softly. "You built a life with a man who thought you were better off without me. Congratulations, you got your wish." Her eyes darted toward the window. "Where do we go from here?" "We," I said, standing. "There's no we anymore. Just you and your reflection. I'm sure you two will have a lot to talk about." She stood too, trembling. "Alex, please. I know I hurt you, but you can't just vanish. Watch me." I opened the door. She hesitated, then turned back. "You ruined his career." I smiled. "No, Olivia. He ruined his own. I just sent the receipts." She left without another word. I watched her walk down the hall, shoulders slumped, dignity somewhere back in the elevator. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. That night, I sat by the window, staring at the city lights. They looked different now, cleaner, sharper, less forgiving. I thought about how much energy I'd wasted trying to be the reasonable one, the peacemaker, the quiet husband who let everything slide in the name of understanding. But understanding doesn't build respect. It just gives manipulators a longer leash. I poured myself a drink and raised it in an invisible toast. "To disappearing," I said quietly. "May no one see you coming or going until you're already free." The next morning, I turned off my phone for good, changed my email, closed the joint account, deleted old photos, old messages, old ghosts. I didn't know anyone closure. Sometimes the best revenge is silence. Not the kind that begs for attention, but the kind that makes people realize you were the quietest storm they ever underestimated. By week's end, I was just a rumor in her contact list. And somewhere out there, Richard Hayes was drafting a LinkedIn post about resilience and career pivots. Cute. As for me, I didn't need to explain where I'd gone or why. I'd already said everything I needed to the one person who never listened. There's a special kind of peace that comes after chaos, the kind you don't trust. The kind that feels like the universe is just catching its breath before punching you again. That was me, 3 weeks after Olivia's meltdown. Life was quiet. Too quiet. My mornings started with coffee instead of confrontation, and my nights ended without someone accusing me of being too logical for emotional growth. I was eating better, sleeping better, and for the first time in years, I didn't have to share my bathroom sink with someone who treated toothpaste caps like optional accessories. I had new routines. My phone stayed on silent. My emails were clean. My apartment didn't smell like her perfume, that citrus blend that used to make me weak, but now reminded me of overpriced guilt. I was, for lack of a better word, free. And freedom, I discovered, doesn't come with trumpets or parades. It comes with an eerie calm that says, you finally stopped trying to fix things that weren't broken. You were just with the wrong mechanic. Then, one morning, around 8 a.m., there was a knock on my door. 3 short, nervous taps, like guilt in human form. I didn't rush to answer. People who knock early in the morning fall into 2 categories: delivery drivers or people bringing bad news. And I hadn't ordered anything lately. When I finally opened the door, there she was. Olivia, my ex-wife in everything but paperwork. She looked exhausted. Not the kind of tired you get from work. The kind that comes from realizing your ego isn't a sustainable energy source. Her hair was messy, her eyes swollen, and her expression was caught somewhere between regret and panic. "Alex," she breathed, clutching her purse like it was life support. "We need to talk." I leaned against the doorframe, calm as ever. "You've got to stop opening with that line. It's cursed." She frowned. "Can I come in?" "Depends. Are you here to return my peace or borrow more of it?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Please." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside. She walked in slowly, scanning the apartment. "You've redecorated." "Yeah," I said. "Turns out a space looks bigger when you remove the tension." She ignored the jab and turned to face me. "I don't know how to say this. Try honesty. It's rare, but I hear it works." She flinched. Richard was fired. "Oh, that's old news," I said, pouring myself coffee. Corporate HR finally found its spine. Good for them. She took a shaky breath. The board launched an internal review. They think I leaked the evidence. I turned slowly, feigning surprise. "No." "Yes," she said, voice trembling. "They said the anonymous email came from my work address. I'm suspended pending investigation." I set my mug down carefully. "Wow. That's awful. Her eyes narrowed. You don't sound surprised. I took a long sip, meeting her stare over the rim. Oh, I'm surprised they took this long. Her jaw dropped. You? I smiled. Who else? You think Richard Hayes just tripped over his own arrogance into a career grave? Her voice rose. You ruined my life. Correction, I said, calm but sharp. I ruined his life. You just happened to be standing next to him when the lightning hit. She shook her head, disbelief plastered across her face. You reported him? You sent those files. Anonymous tip, I said. Very professional. Even attached timestamps. Her voice broke. They think I was complicit. They think I leaked it to save my own job. I shrugged. Maybe now you'll understand what it feels like to be misjudged in public. Full circle moment. Do you even care what's happening to me? She cried. Care, I said softly. You defended a man who told me you could do better, Olivia. You called me impossible for setting boundaries. I stopped caring when you started apologizing for him instead of standing up for us. Tears welled up in her eyes. I didn't cheat, Alex. I nodded. And I didn't kill Richard's career. I just gave gravity a push. She sank onto the couch, covering her face. Everything's falling apart. My job, my reputation. Your excuses, I interrupted. Don't forget those. She looked up at me, red-eyed. I made a mistake. I was stupid. I let him manipulate me. And when I pointed it out, I was paranoid, I said. She winced. You were right, okay? You were right about everything. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I just leaned back against the counter and stared at her. You know what's funny? People think being right feels good. It doesn't. It just means you watched the car crash you predicted in slow motion. She sniffled. I deserve that. No, I said. You deserve honesty. The version I gave you the whole time. The one you mistook for sarcasm. We sat in silence for a moment. The only sound was the hum of my refrigerator and the faint noise of her dignity trying to respawn. Finally, she whispered, Can we start over? I raised an eyebrow. Start over? Olivia, this isn't Monopoly. You don't get a do-over because you rolled bad decisions. I know, she said quickly. But I don't know where else to go. Everyone at work hates me. The friends who used to invite me to brunch stopped replying. I'm learning, I said. Pain's the tuition for self-awareness. Consider this your full scholarship. She laughed through her tears, a broken, bitter sound. You always have a line for everything. Occupational hazard, I said. You crunch enough numbers, and you start to see patterns. Like how people only come back when the house they burned finally cools down. She wiped her face. You think I deserve this? I thought for a moment, then shook my head. No one deserves humiliation. But some people earn the consequences that lead to it. She stared at the floor. I miss you. I sighed. You miss the version of me that made you feel safe. The version you outgrew in public but depended on in private. That guy doesn't live here anymore. Her lip trembled. You don't even sound angry. Because I'm not, I said. Anger means I still want something from you. I don't. She nodded slowly, understanding creeping in like dawn. So that's it. That's it, I said. You wanted me to apologize for respecting myself. I refused. You chose him. He fell. Now you're falling too. That's not revenge, Liv. That's math. She stood up, clutching her bag like a shield. I don't know what I expected. Closure, I said. Everyone comes looking for it. Here's yours. You were loved by someone who would have taken a bullet for you. You chose the man handing out the bullets instead. She flinched like the words were physical. Then, in a voice small enough to break glass, she whispered, I really did love you. I know, I said quietly. You just loved yourself more. She turned to leave, then hesitated at the door. What are you going to do now? I smiled faintly. Live. You should try it sometime, without pretending it's networking. The door clicked shut behind her. I stood there for a long moment, letting the silence settle like dust. The strangest part wasn't relief or satisfaction. It was the emptiness. Like finishing a marathon, you didn't realize you'd been running barefoot. I walked over to the window, looking down at the street below. Cars moved, people hustled, the world went on, perfectly indifferent. I poured myself another cup of coffee, the universal symbol of I survived that conversation. As I sat on the couch, I thought about how easily she'd used the word we. We can fix this. We need to talk. We built a life. But we had always been one-sided, me building, her editing. And now, for the first time, I didn't want we anymore. Just me. Later that night, My phone buzzed with an unknown number. I ignored it. Peace doesn't require permission. I turned on some music, old soul, because irony, and let it fill the apartment. I wasn't celebrating her downfall or gloating over justice. I was just existing, finally on my own terms. And that, I realized, was the real shock. Not that she showed up broken, but that I didn't feel responsible for putting her back together. Closure isn't a conversation, it's a verdict. People think it happens with candles and tissues and hugs that smell like second chances. In reality, it happens on a Tuesday, over cold coffee, when you finally realize you don't owe anyone an explanation for healing. Olivia called again, from an unknown number this time. Rookie move. I answered out of morbid curiosity, like watching a sequel you know will flop. Alex, please, she said. Can we meet? Just to talk. You really love reruns, huh? I replied, but I agreed, because closure, apparently, needed one last meeting on neutral ground, a cafe we used to visit back when love was still affordable. She looked different, smaller somehow. No confidence, no corporate shine. Just a woman sitting across from the man she'd bet against. I lost everything, she said quietly. Not everything, I said, stirring my coffee. You still have the ability to learn. She smiled weakly. You still talk like a therapist who charges extra for sarcasm. Yeah, I said. It's part of my rebranding. She leaned forward. Can't we fix this? I know I ruined things, but maybe. I held up a hand. Stop. We're not broken, we're concluded. There's a difference. You can't rebuild something that was designed to collapse. Her eyes watered. So that's it. That's it, I said. You wanted power, Olivia. You got it. It just didn't come with peace. She looked down, whispering, I never stopped loving you. I took a breath and smiled. Not the cruel kind, the kind you give when the storm's finally passed. And I never stopped wishing you'd figure out what love actually meant. When she left, I didn't watch her go. I didn't need to. Some endings are too clean to mourn. I paid the bill, walked outside, and let the wind hit my face like punctuation. Closure wasn't revenge. It was peace. The kind you earn when you stop trying to explain your worth to people committed to misunderstanding it. Rumor had it, Olivia went freelance, less marketing executive, more LinkedIn philosopher. Every few weeks, someone sent me one of her posts, motivational quotes about growth and accountability, always written by the woman who learned both the hard way. Richard? He's consulting. That's corporate code for unemployed with a fancy email signature. As for me, I'm good. No, better. I'm quietly unstoppable. I sleep through the night. I eat without tension, and my mirror doesn't flinch when I walk by. Done. Used to mean slamming doors and shouting matches. Now it means silence that doesn't ache. I didn't rebuild my life. I reclaimed it. Bought a new couch, painted the walls, deleted old playlists. Turns out, healing isn't dramatic. It's logistical. It's changing passwords, canceling shared subscriptions, and realizing you like your own company more than you ever liked being tolerated. Months later, she texted from a new number. Do you ever think about us? I stared at the screen, smiling. Not bitter, not smug, just free. Then I typed, of course. Every time I see a bad manager on LinkedIn. I hit send, turned off my phone, and went back to my dinner. Steak, medium rare, cooked the way I like it. No arguments, no interruptions, no performance. That's what done really means. Not revenge, not forgetting, but peace. The kind that doesn't need an audience, an apology, or a closing line. Just you, finally living the life you were too busy defending to enjoy. My wife's mom died suddenly, so she became president. My wife smirked. I don't want you in charge. I don't want an idiot like you as a departmental head. The next morning, 30 resignations were on her desk. I looked at her and said, perfect. Her face went pale. No way. Please. My wife, Camille Royce, became president of her late mother's company exactly 2 days after we buried the woman. And let me tell you, grief works differently when there's a corner office involved. Mrs. Eleanor Royce had been the kind of CEO who could make grown men weep into their quarterly reports and turn interns into nervous wrecks with nothing more than a raised eyebrow. She built Royce and Bell Financial from the ground up, turned it into a powerhouse that made Wall Street analysts actually pay attention, and ruled it with an iron fist wrapped in a Chanel blazer. When she passed, the whole corporate world sent their condolences, but honestly, I think half of them were secretly relieved they'd never have to sit across from her in a negotiation again. Camille inherited everything. The title, the mahogany desk that cost more than most people's cars, the executive bathroom with the fancy soap, and unfortunately, her mother's signature move of treating people like they were auditioning for America's biggest disappointment. The first morning she walked into that office as president, I watched her settle into that massive leather chair like it was a throne she'd been eyeing her entire life. She looked good up there, I'll admit, confident, polished, ready to conquer the business world. Then she came home that evening, sat across from me at our ridiculously expensive dining table that her mother had picked out because apparently regular tables weren't good enough for the Royce bloodline, and hit me with the warmest, most loving declaration a husband could hope for. "I don't want you in charge," she said, not even looking up from her phone where she was probably already firing people via text. "I don't want an idiot like you as a departmental head." Romantic, right? Nothing screams, happily married, quite like being called an idiot before you've even finished your dinner. I'm talking full-on character assassination while I was mid-bite into my pasta. I sat there, fork suspended in the air, wondering if this was one of those moments where I should defend myself or just let her cook. I went with option 2, because honestly, arguing with Camille when she's on a power trip is like trying to reason with a hurricane. I just nodded, sipped my wine, and thought to myself, well, at least she didn't call me completely useless this time. That's what we call personal growth in this household. The thing about Camille is that she's brilliant, don't get me wrong. The woman graduated top of her class, speaks 4 languages, can calculate compound interest in her head faster than most people can open a calculator app, and has a wardrobe that costs more than a small country's GDP. But she also inherited her mother's charming belief that volume equals leadership, and that fear is a perfectly acceptable management strategy. She'd been groomed for this position her entire life, shadowing Eleanor through every board meeting, every hostile takeover, every corporate decision that made headlines. In her mind, she was ready. In reality, she was about to learn that inheriting a throne doesn't mean the kingdom automatically respects you. I went to bed that night thinking the insult was the worst of it. Spoiler alert, I was wrong. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Camille's heels clicking frantically across our hardwood floors at a pace that suggested either a medical emergency or a corporate meltdown. I stumbled out of bed, still half asleep, and found her in the kitchen surrounded by what looked like 30 sheets of paper scattered across the granite countertop, like someone had thrown confetti at a funeral. "What's all this?" I asked, reaching for the coffee pot, because there was no way I was dealing with whatever this was without caffeine. "Resignation letters," she said, and her voice had that tight, controlled quality that meant she was about 3 seconds away from either screaming or crying. 30 of them. They all came in overnight. 30 people quit. She looked at me with these wide, almost panicked eyes, like she was waiting for me to freak out with her, to validate that yes, this was indeed the apocalypse. I poured my coffee, took a long, deliberate sip, the kind of sip that says, I'm thinking deeply about this situation, but really means, I'm buying time to figure out if I should laugh or not, and leaned against the doorframe with what I can only describe as my most relaxed posture. "Perfect," I said. The look on her face was absolutely priceless. Her jaw literally dropped, like in those cartoons where the person's mouth falls open and you can practically see their brain short-circuiting. "What do you mean perfect?" she practically shrieked, and I'm pretty sure our neighbors heard her through the walls. 30 people just quit. On my second day, the company is falling apart, and you're standing there drinking coffee like it's a normal Tuesday. I took another sip, just to really drive the point home, and shrugged. "Now you know who the loyal ones are," I explained, using my most reasonable tone, the one I reserve for when I'm about to say something that sounds completely insane but is actually genius. "You just saved yourself 6 months of HR headaches, background checks, and awkward conversations about cultural fit. These people showed their hand. They were never going to respect you, so good riddance. Consider it a corporate cleanse. You're welcome." She just stood there, staring at me like I'd suddenly started speaking ancient Greek. Her perfectly manicured hand was gripping one of the resignation letters so hard I thought she might tear it in half, and I could practically see the wheels turning in her head as she tried to figure out if I was a genius or if she'd married the world's most infuriating optimist. Meanwhile, my coffee had never tasted better. There's something deeply satisfying about being the calm one in a crisis, especially when your wife has spent years treating you like you're incapable of understanding basic addition. The truth was, I knew exactly what was happening. Those 30 resignations weren't random. They were strategic. See, Camille thought she was inheriting a company full of loyal soldiers ready to follow her into battle, but what she actually inherited was her mother's army. And armies don't automatically transfer allegiance just because there's a new general. Eleanor had run that place with fear and respect in equal measure, and while people feared Camille, they sure as hell didn't respect her yet. She was the boss's daughter who'd finally gotten her shot, and half the company probably thought she'd crash and burn within a month. Those 30 people who quit, they were the ones who'd already written her off, the opportunists who figured they could jump ship before it started sinking and get better severance packages elsewhere. But I wasn't about to explain all that to her right then. She needed to figure some things out on her own, and besides, watching her panic was honestly the most entertainment I'd had in months. I finished my coffee, rinsed the mug, and headed toward the door. "Where are you going?" she called after me, still surrounded by her paper catastrophe. "To work," I said. "Some of us still have jobs." The glare she shot me could have melted steel, but I just smiled and walked out. It was going to be an interesting few weeks, that was for sure, and I had a front row seat to the corporate chaos that was about to unfold. Perfect, indeed. Here's the thing about being married to Camille Royce. She genuinely believed I was just some guy with a hobby business who happened to marry well. In her mind, I was the equivalent of a corporate houseplant. Nice to have around, occasionally useful for aesthetic purposes, but ultimately forgettable. She'd introduce me at company events with this practiced smile that said, "Yes, this is my husband. Isn't he cute?" While her eyes screamed, "Please don't ask him about business. He thinks ROI stands for really obvious information." What she didn't know, what she'd somehow missed despite living with me for 5 years, was that my little side business had been handling Royce and Bell's entire digital infrastructure for half a decade. Quietly, efficiently, and completely under the radar. I'm talking servers, cloud storage, cybersecurity protocols, database management, the whole 9 yards. Every time someone at that company sent an email, accessed a file, or printed a document, they were using systems that I built and maintained. And the best part? Her mother knew. Eleanor Royce, the legendary corporate dragon herself, had personally reached out to me 6 years ago after Camille's internal IT team crashed the company's servers for the 3rd time in 2 months. I remember that phone call like it was yesterday. She'd called my personal number, not through Camille, mind you, but directly, and said in that clipped, no-nonsense voice of hers, "My daughter tells me you work with computers. Can you fix incompetence, or just hardware?" I'd laughed, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. Within a week, I had a contract, a direct line to Eleanor, and strict instructions to never, ever tell Camille that her mother had hired me to basically babysit the IT department she'd built. Eleanor would email me at 2 in the morning sometimes, subject lines like, "System down again. Fix it before she wakes up," or "Camille's team broke something," naturally. We had this whole covert operation going where I'd remotely fix whatever disaster her team had created. Eleanor would take the credit for having excellent backup systems, and Camille would go on believing that her IT department was actually competent. It was like being a corporate ghost, except instead of haunting people, I was preventing their technological catastrophes from becoming public knowledge. The money was good, don't get me wrong, but the real payment was watching Camille brag about her team's technical capabilities at dinner parties while I stood there sipping champagne, knowing that her team couldn't find their own ass with both hands and a GPS. There was this one time, about 3 years into our arrangement, where Camille's head of IT, this guy named Derek who wore too much cologne and thought turning it off and on again was beneath him, accidentally deleted an entire quarter's worth of financial records. Just gone. Poof. Vanished into the digital void because Derek thought he was too smart to follow backup protocols. Camille had come home that night, absolutely beside herself, talking about how Derek was working through the night to recover the data and how grateful she was to have such dedicated people. Meanwhile, I'd already restored everything from my own backup servers before she'd even finished her first glass of wine. Eleanor had called me while Camille was in the shower, her voice tight with barely contained rage, and said, "Let Derek sweat until tomorrow morning, then restore it." Maybe he'll learn something, though I doubt it. So that's exactly what I did. Derek got to spend 12 hours thinking his career was over, probably aged 5 years overnight, and then miraculously recovered the data right before the morning meeting. Camille praised him like he'd just discovered fire. I high-fived Eleanor's memory and went about my day. But here's where it gets really interesting. Camille was book-smart in a way that made professors weep with joy. The woman could recite economic theory like poetry, could analyze a company's financials and spot discrepancies that auditors missed, and had this absolutely terrifying ability to memorize every single detail of a contract after reading it once. She graduated summa cum laude from an Ivy League school, had an MBA from another Ivy League school, and had enough business certifications to wallpaper a small apartment. On paper, she was the perfect CEO. In reality, she had the people skills of a cactus and the management style of a dictator running a very expensive dictatorship. She'd been waiting years for her mother's throne, watching Eleanor run that company like a military operation, taking notes, planning her own reign down to the smallest detail. In her mind, she'd earned this position through sheer dedication and familial destiny. She probably had her first 100 days plan outlined in color-coded spreadsheets before her mother's body was even cold, which sounds harsh, but is absolutely something Camille would do. And now that she finally had the big chair, the executive parking spot, and the authority to make grown adults cry, she was acting like she'd just won the Super Bowl, the lottery, and an Oscar all at the same time. I'm talking full Beyoncé energy, except instead of who run the world, girls, it was who runs this Fortune 500 company, me, and don't you forget it. The problem was, Royce and Bell wasn't the same company her mother had built anymore. Things had changed. Eleanor had ruled during a time when hierarchy meant something, when people respected the chain of command because that's just what you did. You showed up, you did your job, you didn't question the boss, and you collected your paycheck. Simple, clean, effective. But Camille's generation of employees? They didn't give a damn about titles or corner offices or who your mother was. They wanted results, transparency, work-life balance, mental health days, and managers who treated them like actual human beings instead of expendable resources. They'd rather quit and find something better than spend one more day working for someone who thought yelling was a valid form of communication. And that's exactly what they did. Those 30 resignations weren't just people jumping ship. They were a message. A big, bold, highlighted and underlined message that said, "We're not doing this anymore." But Camille couldn't see it. In her mind, those people were traitors, cowards who couldn't handle a strong leader. She genuinely believed that her mother's management style would work for her too, that all she had to do was be tough and demanding, and people would fall in line. What she didn't realize was that people had tolerated Eleanor because she'd built the company and had earned their grudging respect through decades of results. Camille? She'd earned nothing yet except a last name and an attitude problem. I watched all of this unfold with the kind of fascination usually reserved for watching a train wreck in slow motion. Part of me felt bad for her. She was trying, in her own misguided, slightly tyrannical way. But another part of me, the part that had been called an idiot at the breakfast table, was thoroughly enjoying watching her figure out that being the boss's daughter and being an actual leader were two completely different skill sets. She thought she was inheriting a kingdom, but what she actually got was a company full of people who were one bad meeting away from updating their LinkedIn profiles. And me? I was just the husband with the side business, quietly keeping the lights on, the servers running, and the whole digital infrastructure from collapsing while she played CEO. I had access to everything, every email, every file, every shady little corner of that company's operations. Not because I was spying, but because that was literally my job. Eleanor had given me keys to the entire kingdom, and Camille had no idea. It was almost poetic, really. She thought I was beneath her, too simple to understand her complex business world, while I was actually the one keeping that world from imploding every single day. God help me. I'd married a woman who thought I was an idiot while I was literally the reason her company's computers still worked. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife, serve it on a plate, and charge people for it at a fancy restaurant. And honestly, I was kind of loving it. By noon that same day, Royce and Bell Financial looked like the set of a zombie apocalypse movie, except instead of the undead wandering around, it was just empty desks, abandoned coffee mugs, and the overwhelming silence of a workplace that had collectively decided, nah, we're good. I decided to swing by the office around lunchtime, partly because I had some server maintenance to check on, but mostly because I had a morbid curiosity about how bad the damage actually was. The scene that greeted me was absolutely spectacular in the worst possible way. Desks that should have been occupied by analysts crunching numbers were just empty spaces with chairs pushed in at weird angles, like people had gotten up mid-task and simply walked out. Phones were ringing off the hook, creating this awful symphony of ignored responsibilities, and the reception area looked like someone had evacuated the building during a fire drill and then just never came back. I found Camille in her mother's old office. Sorry, her office now, pacing back and forth like a caged tiger who'd just realized the cage was made of her own terrible decisions. She was wearing this sharp navy suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her hair was still perfectly styled despite the chaos, but her face had this wild, barely controlled panic that made her look like she was about to either explode or cry. Honestly, it could have gone either way, and I was kind of curious to see which one would win. "They're leaving because of you," she yelled the second she saw me standing in the doorway, pointing at me like I was personally responsible for the mass exodus. I leaned against the doorframe, crossed my arms, and gave her my most innocent smile. "Oh, absolutely," I said, nodding seriously. "I told them I'd pay them double if they resigned dramatically. I even provided templates for their resignation letters. Very professional templates, mind you. I'm thoughtful like that." The sarcasm was so thick you could have spread it on toast, but Camille was too stressed to catch it immediately. For about half a second, she actually looked like she believed me, her eyes widening in horror, before her brain caught up and she realized I was messing with her. The glare she shot me could have burned a hole through reinforced steel. I winked. That definitely didn't help the situation. But here's the thing that made the whole situation absolutely hilarious. The people who didn't resign were telling a very different story than the chaos suggested. The folks who stayed weren't the big-shot managers with the fancy titles and the expense accounts. They weren't the department heads who spent more time in meetings than actually working, or the senior analysts who treated interns like personal servants. Nope. The people who stayed were the quiet ones, the ones who actually kept the company running while everyone else was busy taking credit. I'm talking about people like Marcus from accounting, this middle-aged guy with glasses who could spot a discrepancy in a spreadsheet from 50 feet away and had been silently fixing everyone else's math for years. Or Jenny, one of the executive assistants who knew more about the company's operations than most of the vice presidents because she actually paid attention instead of just nodding along in meetings. And then there was Patricia from data analysis, who'd been with the company for 15 years and had this uncanny ability to predict market trends before they happened, but was constantly overlooked for promotions because she wasn't loud enough or aggressive enough to fit Eleanor's vision of what a leader should look like. These were the real MVPs, the people who showed up every day, did their jobs without drama, and went home without needing to be praised every 5 minutes. They were also, coincidentally, the people who'd been quietly watching me work behind the scenes for years and had figured out that I wasn't just some random dude who happened to marry the boss's daughter. Around 2 in the afternoon, I was in my office. Yes, I had an office at Royce & Bell, tucked away on the 3rd floor in a corner that most people forgot existed, which was exactly how I liked it, when I heard a knock on my door. I looked up from my laptop where I was monitoring the server loads, and there was Marcus, standing in the doorway looking nervous but determined, like he'd just worked up the courage to ask his crush to prom. Behind him were Jenny, Patricia, and about 6 other people who decided to form what looked like a very polite delegation. "Mr. Royce," Marcus said, using my last name even though I'd told him a dozen times to just call me by my first name. "We just wanted to let you know, we're staying. We've seen what you can do." I sat back in my chair, genuinely surprised. "What I can do?" I asked, playing dumb because I wanted to see where this was going. Jenny stepped forward, clutching a tablet like it was a shield. "Sir, we know you've been maintaining the systems. We know you're the reason the servers didn't completely crash last year during the audit. Derek took credit, but we're not stupid. We see the timestamps on the fixes. We see who's actually logging in at 3 in the morning when things break." Patricia nodded enthusiastically. "And we know Mrs. Eleanor trusted you. She mentioned it once, to me actually, said you were the only one around here with any sense." I felt this weird mix of pride and anxiety. Pride because, hey, people noticed. Anxiety because if these people knew, how long before Camille figured it out? But looking at their faces, I realized something kind of beautiful. These people weren't here because of Camille's last name or Eleanor's legacy. They were here because they actually gave a damn about doing good work, and they recognized that I was trying to do the same thing. It was loyalty, but not the fake, corporate ladder-climbing kind. It was the real deal, the we're in this together kind that you can't buy with bonuses or intimidate into existence with angry emails. Well, I said, standing up and walking around my desk, I appreciate that. Really. But you guys know Camille's the president, right? I'm just the IT guy with delusions of relevance. Marcus smiled. Actually smiled, which was rare for him. With respect, sir, you're a lot more than that. And we're hoping you'll help us fix this place before it completely falls apart. The others nodded in agreement, and I realized I was looking at the skeleton crew that was going to either save this company or go down with the ship trying. Either way, it was going to be one hell of a ride. I spent the rest of the afternoon talking with them, really talking, not the corporate BS kind of conversation where everyone says what they think they're supposed to say. We talked about what was actually broken, the toxic management culture, the outdated processes, the way good ideas got buried under layers of bureaucracy, the fact that people were terrified to speak up because they'd seen others get fired for having opinions. It was like opening a floodgate. Turns out, when you actually ask people what's wrong and then listen to their answers, you get some pretty valuable information. Who knew? By 5 o'clock, I had pages of notes, a growing headache, and a plan that was either brilliant or completely insane. Meanwhile, Camille was still in her office, probably staring at those resignation letters and wondering where it all went wrong. Part of me felt bad for her. She'd wanted this position her whole life, had prepared for it, had sacrificed for it, and now it was blowing up in her face before she'd even had a chance to really start. But another part of me, the part that was still annoyed about being called an idiot, thought maybe this was exactly what she needed. A reality check. A wake-up call. A cosmic slap upside the head that said, hey, maybe treating people like disposable assets isn't the winning strategy you think it is. I packed up my stuff around 6, said goodbye to my new unofficial advisory board, and headed home. When I got there, Camille was already on the couch, shoes off, suit jacket thrown over the armrest, looking exhausted and defeated. She didn't say anything when I walked in, just stared at the ceiling like it might have answers written up there in invisible ink. I thought about saying something comforting, something supportive, something husbandly. Instead, I just headed to the kitchen, made myself a sandwich, and figured she'd talk when she was ready. Or she wouldn't. Either way, tomorrow was going to be interesting, and I needed to be well fed for whatever fresh disaster was coming next. 2 weeks after the Great Resignation, as I'd started calling it in my head, Camille began experiencing what I can only describe as a technological curse. It started small, an email that mysteriously disappeared, a password that suddenly stopped working even though she swore she hadn't changed it, a report that she'd saved 3 times but somehow vanished into the digital abyss. At first, she blamed herself, which was actually pretty big character development for someone who usually blamed everyone else for everything, including bad weather. She'd mutter things like, I must have deleted it by accident, or maybe I forgot to hit save, while furiously clicking her mouse like that would somehow make her files reappear through sheer force of will. But then the problems escalated. Systems started crashing at the worst possible times, right before important video calls with investors, during crucial data transfers, in the middle of presentations that she'd spent days preparing. Her laptop developed this charming habit of freezing whenever she opened anything more complex than a blank document, and the company's shared drives seemed to have developed selective amnesia about which files belonged to her. It was like watching someone slowly lose their mind, except instead of ghosts haunting them, it was technology deciding to stage a personal rebellion. The thing was, none of these problems were affecting anyone else. Marcus's computer worked fine. Jenny's laptop was running smooth as butter. Even the ancient desktop that Patricia used, which was probably older than some of the interns, was chugging along without issues. It was just Camille, specifically and exclusively, getting absolutely wrecked by technical difficulties. One evening, around 8 o'clock, when most normal people were home watching Netflix or pretending to exercise, Camille stormed into my office holding her laptop, like it had personally insulted her entire family lineage. Her hair was coming loose from its usual perfect style. Her mascara was slightly smudged, which for Camille was basically the equivalent of showing up to work in pajamas, and she had this wild look in her eyes that suggested she was about 3 seconds away from throwing her very expensive computer out the window. "The files are gone," she announced, slamming the laptop down on my desk hard enough to make my coffee mug jump. "All of them. The quarterly reports, the investor presentations, the restructuring plans, everything. Just gone." I looked up from my screen where I'd been monitoring some routine server maintenance, took in her panicked expression, and asked the question that IT people have been asking since the dawn of computing. "Did you try turning it off and back on again?" The look she gave me could have curdled milk. I'm talking pure, concentrated rage mixed with desperation and a hint of, "I might actually murder you right here," and claim temporary insanity. She stood there, breathing heavily, probably counting to 10 in her head to avoid committing spousal homicide in a corporate office, and I realized that maybe humor wasn't the best approach for this particular meltdown. "Give me the laptop," I said, holding out my hand. "Let me take a look." She handed it over reluctantly, like she was worried I'd somehow make it worse, which was kind of insulting considering I literally built half the systems she was using. I opened it up, ran a few diagnostic commands that probably looked like magic to her, and immediately saw the problem. Or rather, problems, plural, because whoever was messing with her system had been thorough. Files weren't just missing. They'd been moved, hidden, or in some cases corrupted just enough to be unusable, but not enough to trigger automatic backup protocols. It was actually kind of impressive in a deeply concerning way. This wasn't accidental user error or random technical glitches. This was deliberate sabotage, and whoever was doing it knew exactly what they were doing. While I was poking around in her system, my assistant Zoe appeared in the doorway like a ninja with better fashion sense. Zoe was this 26-year-old force of nature who'd started as an intern 3 years ago and had somehow become indispensable despite, or maybe because of, her complete inability to take anything seriously. She had purple streaks in her hair this week, wore band t-shirts under her blazers, and had a sense of humor sharper than most surgical instruments. She was also scary good with computers and had a talent for digging up information that people thought they'd buried. Eleanor had loved her, which was probably the highest compliment anyone could receive, and I'd made her my unofficial second-in-command because she was brilliant and slightly terrifying in equal measure. "Sir," Zoe said, leaning against the doorframe with this casual confidence that made Camille bristle. My wife didn't appreciate when other women in the office acted like they belonged there, which was its own problematic issue we weren't going to unpack right now. Her IT guy's been secretly feeding data to a rival company. She said it casually, like she was commenting on the weather or mentioning that we were out of coffee, not dropping a bomb that could destroy careers and potentially land someone in jail. Camille's had whipped around so fast I was worried she'd give herself whiplash. "What?" she practically screeched, her voice going up about 3 octaves. I held up a hand, gesturing for Camille to calm down, which, pro tip, never actually makes anyone calm down, and looked at Zoe. "How sure are you?" I asked, because Zoe had a flair for the dramatic and sometimes exaggerated for effect, though she was usually right about the important stuff. She pushed off from the doorframe, walked over to my desk, and pulled out her phone, tapping through it with the speed of someone who'd grown up with technology as an extension of their hand. "Like, I have screenshots, email trails, and bank transfers, sure," she said, turning the phone so I could see. "Derek, you know, the IT director who thinks he's God's gift to cybersecurity, has been selling client information, financial reports, and strategic plans to Hastings and Cole for the past 8 months. He's made about 200 grand off it, which honestly seems low for corporate espionage, but I guess he's not great at negotiating." "Of course he has," I muttered, because honestly, this tracked perfectly with everything else that was falling apart. Derek was exactly the type of guy who'd think he was smarter than everyone else, that he could pull off something like this without getting caught, that the rules didn't apply to him because he was so clever and important. Camille looked like she was either going to faint or start breaking things, possibly both. "Derek?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper now. "Derek's been working for me, for my mother, for 7 years. He restructured our entire security system. He has access to everything." "Exactly," Zoe said, nodding like a professor whose student had just figured out the answer. Which is why he's the perfect person to steal everything. Who's going to suspect the guy in charge of keeping things secure? It's like hiring a fox to guard the henhouse, and then being shocked when chickens start disappearing. She looked at Camille with something that might have been sympathy if Zoe were capable of such straightforward emotions. No offense, but your hiring process has more red flags than a communist parade. I shot Zoe a look that said, maybe tone down the sass while my wife is having a breakdown, but she just shrugged. Camille sank into one of my office chairs, her laptop forgotten, her whole world clearly crumbling around her. This place, she said quietly, more to herself than to us. This place leaks more than a cheap umbrella in a hurricane. I almost smiled at that because, hey, self-awareness was progress, but I managed to keep my expression neutral. Zoe, with her impeccable sense of timing and complete lack of filter, chose that moment to slide a flash drive onto my desk. It was bright pink with a Hello Kitty sticker on it, because of course it was. You might want to see this, she said, tapping the drive with one purple fingernail. It's not just Derek. He's got help. Internal help. I picked up the flash drive, turning it over in my hand, and felt that familiar mix of curiosity and dread that comes with knowing you're about to open a whole new can of worms. How bad? I asked. Zoe's expression, usually set to some degree of amused sarcasm, went serious. Bad enough that when you see it, you're going to need something stronger than coffee. She glanced at Camille, who was still sitting there looking shell-shocked, and added, maybe pour her some wine first. Actually, pour me some too. Hell, let's just get the whole bottle. The flash drive contained about 40 gigabytes of information that Zoe had somehow compiled. Emails, messages, file transfers, even some security camera footage that she'd pulled from God knows where. I spent the next hour going through it while Camille looked over my shoulder, her breath catching every time she recognized a name or saw something particularly damning. Derek wasn't working alone. He had at least 5 other people helping him, including 2 managers that Camille had personally promoted and 1 executive assistant who'd been with the company since before Camille was born. They'd been systematically siphoning information, client lists, proprietary strategies, financial projections, basically anything that competitors would pay for, and selling it like they were running a corporate yard sale. Your mother's trusted circle, I said, scrolling through yet another incriminating email thread, is more like a trusted circus. And not the fun kind with elephants and cotton candy. The kind where everything's on fire and the clowns are stealing your wallet. Camille didn't laugh. She just stood there, watching her company's dirty secrets scroll across my screen, probably realizing that the empire her mother built had been rotting from the inside, while everyone was too busy pretending everything was fine. When we finally finished going through everything, it was past midnight. Zoe had long since left, telling us to burn it all down, metaphorically speaking, because actual arson is illegal and I'd rather not be an accessory. I didn't tell Camille what I was planning, which probably sounds like a recipe for marital disaster, but hear me out. I needed to see exactly how deep the rabbit hole went before I started pulling people out of it. You know that feeling when you find one cockroach in your kitchen and you just know, that there are probably 50 more hiding in the walls. That's exactly what this situation felt like, except instead of cockroaches, it was corrupt employees, and instead of walls, it was layers upon layers of corporate bureaucracy that had been specifically designed to hide incompetence and fraud. I wanted to watch these people, see who they talked to, follow the money trail, and figure out which people were actively sabotaging the company versus which ones were just useless dead weight riding the payroll like it was a luxury cruise ship. The morning after our late-night revelation session, I came downstairs to find Camille already at the breakfast table, looking like she'd maybe slept 3 hours if we were being generous. She was doing that thing where she pretended to read something on her tablet, but was actually just staring at the screen without processing anything, probably replaying every interaction she'd ever had with Derek and wondering how she'd missed all the signs. I poured myself some coffee. The good stuff, the expensive beans that Camille's mother used to import from some obscure region of Colombia, and sat down across from her with my most relaxed, nothing to see here expression. "How's the kingdom?" I asked, taking a sip and savoring the taste while watching her over the rim of my mug. She looked up at me with these tired, slightly defeated eyes that almost made me feel guilty for enjoying this situation as much as I was. Almost. "Under control," she said, which was possibly the most optimistic lie I'd heard all week, and I'd been listening to a lot of corporate executives trying to justify their existence lately. She spooned her yogurt with the mechanical precision of someone who was going through the motions of normal life while internally screaming, and I had to admit, it was kind of impressive how well she was holding it together considering her entire professional world had just imploded like a building in a controlled demolition. Perfect, I said, letting that word hang in the air between us like a particularly smug cloud. She flinched, actually physically flinched, and I couldn't help but smile into my coffee because that reaction was absolutely priceless. She'd started associating that word with impending disaster, which was fair because every time I'd said it recently, something terrible had been happening or was about to happen. It was like Pavlov's experiment, except instead of dogs and bells, it was my wife and my favorite word. She opened her mouth like she was going to say something, probably something along the lines of, "Why do you keep saying that?" or "I hate you," but then seemed to think better of it and just went back to her yogurt with the resignation of someone who'd accepted that the universe was out to get her. Behind the scenes, while Camille was busy trying to hold the company together with duct tape and sheer willpower, I was working with my skeleton crew of actually competent employees to systematically unfuck everything that had been fucked over the past several years. Zoe became my right hand, which terrified some people because she had this habit of showing up in places she technically wasn't supposed to be and knowing things she definitely shouldn't know. Marcus from accounting turned into our financial detective, going through years of records with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that would make an FBI forensic accountant proud. And then there was Jude, the night janitor who everyone ignored because he was just the cleaning guy, but who turned out to be sitting on an MBA from a pretty decent business school and had more dirt on the company's executives than a tabloid journalist. Jude was actually my secret weapon in all of this. The man had been pushing a mop and emptying trash cans for 6 years, but what nobody realized was that people talk when they think nobody important is listening. He'd overheard conversations in conference rooms that people thought were empty. He'd seen documents left on desks that should have been shredded. He'd watched people do things they thought nobody was watching. When I first approached him, laid out what we were dealing with, and asked if he'd be willing to help, he just smiled and said, "I was wondering when someone would finally notice." Turns out he'd been keeping notes for years, just in case, stored in a series of notebooks that he kept in his locker like some kind of corporate spy novel protagonist. We restructured digital access first, which was my specialty and also the most crucial thing, because if we couldn't control who saw what, we couldn't control anything. I revoked permissions, changed passwords, implemented new security protocols, and basically built a digital fortress around anything that actually mattered. Every suspicious transaction got flagged and tracked. Every questionable file transfer got logged. Every email from Derek or his little gang of corporate criminals got automatically copied to a secure server that only I could access. It was beautiful, elegant, and completely invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. We were essentially building a case against these people using their own actions, letting them dig their own graves while they thought they were still getting away with everything. By the end of that week, I had enough evidence to plant an entire forest of incrimination. We're talking emails where Derek literally discussed prices for stolen information, bank transfers that were about as subtle as a neon sign saying illegal activity here, and even some voice recordings that Zoe had somehow obtained through methods I decided not to ask about because plausible deniability is a beautiful thing. The paper trail, or digital trail, I guess, since nobody actually uses paper anymore except for signing important stuff, was so clear that even a mediocre lawyer could have built a case with it, and we weren't planning on hiring mediocre anything. I still hadn't told Camille the full extent of what we'd found or what I was planning to do with it. Part of that was strategic. The fewer people who knew, the less chance of someone tipping off Derek and his crew. But part of it, and I'm not proud of this, but I'm also not sorry about it, was that I wanted to see her reaction when everything came together. Call it petty, call it vindictive, call it whatever you want. But after years of being treated like I was too stupid to understand her complicated business world, I was going to enjoy the moment when she realized that not only did I understand it, but I understood it well enough to save her entire company from collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. Camille called an emergency board meeting with all the confidence of a general rallying troops before a major battle, except in this case. Half her troops were secretly working for the enemy, and the other half were just waiting to see how badly this was going to blow up in her face. The meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning on a Thursday, which was apparently peak time for corporate intimidation tactics, and she'd sent out an email the night before with the subject line, "Mandatory attendance, restructuring discussion," in all caps, because nothing says, "I'm a competent leader," quite like threatening people with capital letters. I got a copy of the email even though I technically wasn't required to attend, but Camille had added a little note at the bottom that said, "You should probably be there," which in wife speak translated to, "I need moral support, but I'm too proud to actually ask for it." I decided to tag along, mostly because free coffee and corporate drama is basically my favorite combination, but also because I had a pretty good feeling that this meeting was going to be memorable for all the wrong reasons. I showed up wearing khakis and a button-down shirt, looking like every middle management guy who'd ever existed, which was exactly the vibe I was going for, because the best way to drop a bomb is to look completely harmless while you're doing it. The boardroom was on the top floor, one of those ridiculous spaces with floor-to-ceiling windows that probably cost more than a small house, and a conference table so long you could have used it as a bowling lane. When I walked in, Camille was already at the head of the table, surrounded by her remaining directors and managers, most of whom looked like they'd rather be literally anywhere else. She started the meeting strong, I'll give her that. She launched into this whole speech about discipline and accountability, about how the company needed to return to its roots, about how her mother's vision was going to guide them through this difficult transition period. Her voice had that commanding quality that she'd probably practiced in the mirror, and for a moment, she actually looked like she knew what she was doing. The directors were nodding along, doing that thing where they pretend to care while mentally updating their resumes, and Derek was sitting there with this smug little smile, like he thought he was untouchable. That smile really annoyed me, the kind of annoying that makes you want to do something petty just to watch it disappear. About halfway through Camille's speech, right when she was getting to the part about renewed commitment to excellence, or some other corporate buzzword bingo, I raised my hand like I was back in elementary school asking permission to go to the bathroom. The whole room went quiet, and Camille looked at me with this mixture of confusion and irritation because apparently I was breaking some unspoken rule about husbands not participating in actual business discussions. "Yes," she said, her tone suggesting that whatever I was about to say better be important enough to justify interrupting her moment of glory. "Honey, quick question," I said, using my most casual, conversational voice like I was asking about dinner plans instead of about to destroy several careers. "Why did the company lose $1.8 billion in phantom accounts last quarter?" The silence that followed was the kind of silence you could bottle and sell as a weapon. Every single person in that room stopped breathing for about 3 seconds, and I watched Camille's face cycle through several emotions: confusion, disbelief, anger, and then this creeping horror as she realized I wasn't joking. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice coming out smaller than she probably intended. I reached into the folder I'd been carrying, the one that everyone had probably assumed contained nothing more interesting than maybe some IT reports or my grocery list, and pulled out a document that Zoe and Marcus had helped me prepare. It was beautiful, really, color-coded, cross-referenced, with charts and graphs that made the corruption so obvious that even someone who'd never seen a financial statement could understand it. I tossed it across the table with just enough force that it slid perfectly to a stop right in front of Camille, which was a move I'd been practicing because presentation matters. "That," I said, letting my words drop into the silence like stones into still water, "is what happens when your IT director thinks Excel is a fancy energy drink and your managers think embezzlement is a valid retirement strategy." Every director at that table leaned forward simultaneously, like they were puppets on strings, all trying to get a look at the document. I watched their faces as they started processing what they were seeing: the fake accounts, the money transfers, the shell companies that Derek and his crew had set up to siphon funds. Camille picked up the file with shaking hands, her eyes scanning the pages, and I could see the exact moment when everything clicked into place for her. Her face went from confused to pale to absolutely furious in the span of about 10 seconds, which was actually kind of impressive from a purely observational standpoint. "This can't be right," she said, but her voice had lost all its earlier confidence and now just sounded desperate, like she was hoping that if she denied it hard enough, reality would just rearrange itself to be less terrible. Derek, to his credit or maybe his stupidity, tried to play it cool. "That's clearly fabricated," he said, using his most professional, trustworthy voice, the one he probably used when lying to clients. "Those numbers are taken out of context, and I can explain every single transaction if given the opportunity." I almost laughed at the sheer audacity of it. This guy sitting there acting like he could talk his way out of documented evidence of corporate fraud. But here's where it got really good. Zoe, who'd been waiting outside like we'd planned, walked in at that exact moment carrying a laptop and looking like she was about to enjoy herself immensely. "Actually," she said, setting the laptop down and opening it to show a video file, "you can't explain this." She hit play, and suddenly the room was filled with the sound of Derek's voice. Not from the meeting, but from a recording of him on the phone with someone from Hastings & Cole, our biggest competitor, literally discussing which files he was going to steal next and how much they were worth. The timestamp on the video was from 3 days ago, which meant he'd been doing this even after the mass resignation, even while Camille was scrambling to keep the company together. You could hear the oxygen leave the room, like someone had opened an airlock in space. Derek's smug smile evaporated faster than water on hot pavement, and he went from confident to panicked in record time. The other directors were staring at him like he'd just sprouted a second head, and a couple of them were already quietly gathering their things because they clearly wanted no part of whatever was about to happen. Camille just sat there, still holding my report, looking at Derek with an expression that was equal parts betrayal and rage. "You can't believe this," Derek shouted, standing up so fast his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. "This is clearly a setup. He's trying to frame me." The chairman of the board, this older guy named Henderson who'd been working with Eleanor since the company started and had the kind of face that suggested he'd seen every corporate disaster imaginable, looked at Derek with the cold, clinical detachment of someone about to watch a car crash. "We do believe it," he said calmly, his voice carrying the weight of decades of business experience. "Because it's on video, it matches our audit findings, and frankly, Derek, you're not smart enough to have covered your tracks as well as you think you did." That last part was just brutal, the kind of professional insult that hits harder than any curse word could, and I made a mental note to buy Henderson a drink sometime. The next morning, I woke up at 5:30 in the morning with the kind of clarity that only comes from either enlightenment or spite, and in my case, it was definitely the latter. I'd spent the previous evening compiling everything, and I mean everything, into one comprehensive report that would make a federal prosecutor weep with joy. We're talking spreadsheets, transaction records, email chains, video evidence, audio recordings, witness statements from employees who'd finally felt safe enough to come forward, and even some security footage that Jude had miraculously found in the archives. It was 147 pages of pure, unfiltered corporate corruption documented in excruciating detail, organized with the kind of obsessive precision that would make a librarian jealous, and formatted so clearly that even a first-year business student could follow the trail of fraud from beginning to end. I titled it "The Rot Beneath the Floorboards," a comprehensive analysis of systemic corruption at Royce & Bell Financial, because if you're going to blow up someone's world, you might as well do it with style and a pretentious title that sounds like it could be a best-selling book about corporate malfeasance. I attached it to an email, typed in the addresses for every single board member, including Henderson, added Camille to the CC list because I'm not completely heartless and figured she should at least get a heads up before her inbox exploded, and hovered my cursor over the send button for approximately 3 seconds before thinking screw it, and clicking that bad boy with the satisfaction of someone who'd just launched a missile at a very deserving target. The subject line read, "The Rot Beneath the Floorboards. Urgent board review required." And in the body of the email, I kept it simple and professional because sometimes the most devastating things are said in the calmest language. I wrote, "Distinguished board members, attached please find a comprehensive audit of financial irregularities, data breaches, and systematic fraud occurring within Royce & Bell Financial over the past 18 months. This report includes irrefutable evidence of criminal activity by senior staff members. Immediate action is required. The company's reputation and financial stability are at significant risk. Respectfully submitted for your urgent review." And then I signed it with my full name, My credentials that most people didn't know I had because I'd never bothered to flaunt them, and hit send before I could second-guess myself. I heard Camille's phone buzz from the bedroom about 30 seconds later, which meant she had her email notifications on even at this ungodly hour because she was one of those people who couldn't disconnect from work even in her sleep. I waited, listening to the sounds of her waking up, the rustling of sheets, the padding of her feet across the floor, and then the silence that comes right before someone sees something that fundamentally changes their understanding of reality. Then came the storm. Her heels. She'd apparently put on heels at 5:45 in the morning, which honestly was either dedication or insanity, started clicking across our hardwood floors at a pace that suggested she was either coming to kill me or coming to demand an explanation, possibly both. She burst into my office where I was sitting with my coffee, already on my second cup because I'd known this was coming and had prepared accordingly, and her hair was wild in a way I'd never seen before. We're talking full-on Medusa energy, like she'd been pulling at it while reading the report, and her eyes had this mixture of fury and something else. Maybe respect, maybe fear, maybe just the dawning realization that her husband wasn't the harmless idiot she'd thought he was. "You sent that?" she shouted, waving her phone at me like it was a weapon, and I noticed she was still in her pajamas under her blazer, which was a fashion choice that really emphasized how rattled she was. "Of course," I said, taking another sip of my coffee with the kind of deliberate calm that I knew would either diffuse the situation or make it exponentially worse. "It's called transparency. It's very trendy right now in the business world. You should try it sometime." The sarcasm was perhaps not my best choice given that she looked like she was contemplating whether divorce or murder would be more satisfying. But at this point, I was committed to the bit. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again like a fish trying to figure out how to breathe air, and then just stood there processing the magnitude of what I'd done. "The board," she finally managed to say, her voice strangled. "You sent this to the entire board, including Henderson, including the external auditors, including, oh my God, you CC'd the company's legal counsel." "I did," I confirmed, nodding like we were discussing something as mundane as the weather forecast. Figured they'd all want to know that the company they're legally responsible for has been hemorrhaging money faster than a lottery winner with no financial planning skills. Call me crazy, but I thought that was information they might find relevant. Camille sank into the chair across from my desk, her phone falling from her hand onto her lap, and I watched her cycle through what looked like all 5 stages of grief in the span of about 30 seconds. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally something that might have been acceptance or might have been her just giving up on the concept of controlling anything anymore. Within an hour, my inbox started filling up with responses. Henderson was first, naturally, because the man probably slept with his phone next to his bed and woke up checking the stock market before his eyes were fully open. His email was short and to the point. Emergency session called for 9 a.m. All board members required. Bring everything. Then came responses from the other board members, each one expressing varying degrees of shock, horror, and in a couple cases, a sort of grim satisfaction that suggested they'd suspected something was wrong but hadn't been able to prove it. One board member, a woman named Patricia Chun who'd been arguing for better oversight for years, sent me a separate email that just said, "Thank you." Finally, which was somehow more validating than any of the others. By 8:30, Camille and I were in the car heading to the office, and the silence between us was the kind of loaded silence that could either explode into a massive fight or just sit there festering forever. She'd managed to pull herself together, put on a proper outfit, fix her hair, and apply makeup that hid most of the evidence that she'd been having a personal crisis, but I could see the tension in her shoulders and the way her hands kept clenching and unclenching in her lap. "You planned this," she said finally, not looking at me, just staring straight ahead at the traffic like it held the answers to all life's questions. It wasn't a question, more like a statement of fact that she was still coming to terms with. "No," I said, and I meant it honestly. I just pressed send. Everything else was already there, already happening. I just made sure people couldn't ignore it anymore. She turned to look at me then, really look at me, and I saw something shift in her expression. It was like she was seeing me clearly for the first time in our entire marriage, seeing past the guy she'd married who she thought was just a harmless tech nerd with a small business, and recognizing that maybe, just maybe, she'd completely misjudged who I was and what I was capable of. Why? She asked, and her voice was softer now, less angry and more genuinely confused. Why would you do this? You could have just let it all burn. You could have let me fail. I thought about that question for a moment, watching the city pass by outside the window, all those buildings full of people going about their lives with no idea that a corporate empire was about to implode in a conference room downtown. Because, I said finally, despite everything, despite you calling me an idiot and treating me like I was too stupid to understand your world, I don't actually want to see you fail. I want to see you succeed. But you can't succeed by ignoring problems or surrounding yourself with people who are actively destroying what your mother built. Sometimes the only way to save something is to burn out the infection, even if it hurts. We pulled into the parking garage, and I could see news vans already setting up outside the building because somehow word had leaked, probably through one of the board members who had connections to the business press, that something big was going down at Royce and Bell Financial. Camille saw them too and let out a long, shaky breath. "This is going to be bad," she said, and I couldn't tell if she meant the meeting or the media circus or just everything in general. "Yeah," I agreed, unbuckling my seatbelt and preparing to walk into what was probably going to be the most dramatic board meeting in the company's history. But at least it'll be honest. That's got to count for something, right? The boardroom was already full when we arrived. Every single member present, including some who I'd never even seen in person before, because they usually attended meetings remotely from whatever beach or mountain they were vacationing on. Henderson was at the head of the table, and he had that expression that people get when they're about to do something unpleasant but necessary, like a dentist preparing to pull a tooth or a parent about to have the talk with their teenager. Camille took her seat, and I stood against the wall because I technically wasn't a board member and hadn't been invited to sit, but nobody was going to kick me out when I was the one who'd brought all the evidence. Henderson started the meeting without any of the usual pleasantries or small talk. "We've all read the report," he said, his voice grave, "or at least enough of it to understand the severity of the situation. Ms. Royce, your husband has presented us with evidence of systematic fraud, embezzlement, corporate espionage, and gross negligence spanning multiple departments and involving at least 7 senior staff members, including your IT director, 2 department heads, and 3 managers." Camille tried to defend herself, starting to explain that she hadn't known, that she'd trusted these people, that her mother had trusted them, but Henderson held up a hand to stop her. After the board meeting ended, which concluded with Derek being escorted out by actual security guards while he shouted something about lawyers and defamation that nobody was listening to, Camille didn't talk to me for 2 whole weeks. I'm not talking about the cold shoulder or the silent treatment where you can still feel the tension radiating off someone like heat from asphalt in July. I'm talking about full radio silence, like I'd suddenly become invisible or she'd decided that acknowledging my existence would somehow validate that I'd been right about everything, and she couldn't quite handle that level of ego damage yet. She'd leave for work before I woke up, come home after I'd gone to bed, and communicate exclusively through passive-aggressive notes left on the kitchen counter about things like grocery shopping and whose turn it was to deal with the yard service. Honestly, those were the most peaceful 2 weeks of my entire married life. I'm not even being sarcastic here, which is rare for me. I could watch whatever I wanted on TV without having to negotiate or pretend to care about reality shows where rich people created fake drama for entertainment. I could eat cereal for dinner without judgment, leave my socks on the floor for a full 24 hours before picking them up, and generally exist in a state of comfortable chaos that married men dream about but rarely experience. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been since before we got married, and while I knew this peaceful silence was probably the eye of a hurricane and that eventually we'd have to actually deal with everything that had happened, I was content to enjoy the calm while it lasted. But reality has this annoying habit of catching up with you eventually. And in this case, reality came in the form of the company's quarterly earnings report, which, thanks to my team's efforts to stop the bleeding and restructure operations, actually showed improvement for the first time in 18 months. We'd cut the dead weight, both literally in terms of the people we'd fired for fraud and figuratively in terms of outdated processes that were costing more than they were worth, and implemented new systems that actually worked. Revenue was up, client satisfaction scores had improved, and most importantly, we weren't actively hemorrhaging money to corporate spies anymore, which was a low bar to clear, but apparently one that the previous management had struggled with. The board was pleased, obviously, because board members love nothing more than numbers going in the right direction, and they'd started asking questions about who was responsible for the turnaround. Henderson, bless his cynical corporate heart, had been very clear that the improvements were directly related to the restructuring that I'd initiated and that my team, Zoe, Marcus, Patricia, and even Jude, who'd officially been promoted from janitor to operations consultant, because why not, had implemented. Camille's name was conspicuously absent from most of these conversations, not because people were trying to undermine her, but because she literally hadn't been involved in any of the actual work. She'd been too busy processing her own feelings and avoiding her husband to actually participate in saving her company. Eventually, she came around, mostly because her company was still standing and she'd started to realize that maybe, just maybe, her pride wasn't worth losing everything her mother had built. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, completely without warning, when I was in my office reviewing some security protocols that Zoe had flagged as needing updates. I heard a knock on my door, which was unusual because most people just walked in or sent me a message, and when I looked up, Camille was standing there in this perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than my car payment. But her expression was softer than I'd seen it in months, maybe years. She walked in slowly, like she was approaching a wild animal that might bolt if she moved too fast, and sat down in the chair across from my desk. We looked at each other for a long moment, and I could see her trying to figure out how to say whatever she'd come to say. Finally, she took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and said, "I might have been wrong about you. Not, I was wrong, mind you, but I might have been wrong, because apparently, even in apology, Camille couldn't commit to full accountability without leaving herself an escape clause. It was so perfectly her that I almost laughed, but I managed to keep my expression neutral. Wow, I said, reaching for my phone and making a show of opening the voice recorder app. Let me record that. It's a historical moment. Future generations need to know that on this day, at this time, Camille Royce admitted the possibility of being incorrect about something. She rolled her eyes, but there was the ghost of a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth, which was more progress than I'd expected. "Don't be a jerk about it," she said, but without any real heat behind the words. "I'm trying to apologize here, which is not something I'm particularly good at, as you might have noticed during our entire marriage." I put my phone down and leaned back in my chair, studying her. She looked tired in a way that expensive concealer couldn't quite hide, and I realized that the past few weeks had probably been harder on her than I'd thought. Having your entire professional worldview shattered and rebuilt will do that to a person, I guess. "You don't have to apologize," I said, which surprised both of us because I absolutely could have milked this moment for all it was worth. "But you do have to stop treating the people around you like they're either beneath you or out to get you. Most people are just trying to do their jobs and go home without having a breakdown in the parking lot." She nodded, looking down at her hands which were folded in her lap in this uncharacteristically uncertain way. "My mother ran things differently," she said quietly. "She was tough because she had to be. She built this company from nothing in an industry that didn't want to take her seriously because she was a woman. She couldn't afford to be soft or collaborative or any of those things that modern management books say you're supposed to be. She had to be harder, tougher, more ruthless than any man in the room just to be taken half as seriously." I'd heard this story before, or versions of it, and I understood where Camille was coming from. Eleanor had been a force of nature operating in a time when women CEOs were rare enough to be newsworthy, and she'd carved out her empire through sheer willpower and an absolute refusal to be underestimated. "I get that," I said, and I meant it. "Your mom was incredible, and she did what she had to do to survive in her era. But Camille, you're not your mother, and this isn't her era anymore. The world changed. The people changed. You can't run a modern company the same way she ran one 30 years ago any more than you could run it using business strategies from the 1950s. Different times require different approaches, and if you can't adapt, you're going to keep losing good people who'd rather work anywhere else than put up with being yelled at for existing." She looked up at me then, and I saw something I'd rarely seen in her eyes. Actual vulnerability. "I don't know how to be anything else," she admitted. "I've been preparing my whole life to step into her shoes, to be her successor, to carry on her legacy. I don't know who I am as a leader if I'm not trying to be her." That was probably the most honest thing she'd said to me in our entire relationship, and it made something in my chest ache in a way I hadn't expected. I stood up, walked around my desk, and leaned against it so I was closer to her, but not hovering. "Then figure it out," I said simply. "You're smart enough, capable enough, and despite your best efforts to hide it, you actually do care about this company and the people who work here. Stop trying to be Eleanor Royce version 2.0 and figure out who Camille Royce is as a leader. Maybe she's collaborative. Maybe she's innovative. Maybe she actually listens to people and builds consensus instead of ruling through fear and intimidation. You won't know until you try." She sat there processing that for a long moment, and I could practically see the wheels turning in her head. "The board wants you more involved," she said finally. "Henderson specifically said that the company needs your expertise, that the turnaround wouldn't have happened without you, and that it would be foolish not to utilize your skills more formally." I'd been expecting this conversation, honestly. Henderson had already approached me privately about taking on an official role, maybe Chief Technology Officer or even Chief Operations Officer, but I told him I wanted to talk to Camille first because going over her head would just create more problems. "What do you want?" I asked, because that was really what mattered here. "This is your company, your position, your call. If you want me to stay in the background and just keep the tech running, I can do that. If you want me to take on a bigger role and help restructure operations, I can do that too. But I need to know that you're okay with it, that we're actually on the same team here, because I'm not interested in playing corporate politics with my own wife." She stood up, smoothing down her suit in that automatic way people do when they're buying time to think, and looked at me directly. "I want you to help me fix this place," she said. "Not because the board says I should, but because I'm finally smart enough to realize that I can't do it alone. And you're probably the only person I trust who isn't trying to steal from me or sell company secrets to our competitors." It wasn't exactly a Hallmark card declaration, but coming from Camille, it was basically a proclamation of eternal devotion. "Okay," I said, extending my hand for a handshake because we apparently needed to formalize this moment. She looked at my hand, then at me, and then did something completely unexpected. She hugged me. It was brief and slightly awkward because we were in an office and she was still working through her feelings about being wrong, but it was genuine. When she pulled back, she had this determined look on her face that I recognized from when she was about to tackle a problem head-on. "Don't make me regret this," she said, trying to sound threatening but failing because we both knew she'd already made up her mind. "Too late to back out now," I said, grinning. "You just admitted I was right about something. That's legally binding in at least 47 states. Under new management, which was basically me, Zoe, and our ragtag team of people who actually gave a damn, Royce and Bell Financial didn't just recover, it absolutely thrived in a way that made industry analysts scramble to figure out what the hell we'd done differently. Within 6 months, we'd posted record profits that exceeded even Eleanor's best quarters, and the business media was losing their minds trying to explain how a company that had been hemorrhaging talent and money just half a year ago was suddenly the darling of the financial sector. The secret, of course, wasn't actually that complicated. We stopped treating employees like expendable robots and started treating them like human beings with lives, feelings, and the basic need to not hate every second of their existence at work. I implemented flexible working hours first, which sounds simple, but was apparently revolutionary in an industry where face time and grinding were considered virtues and working yourself into an early grave was seen as dedication rather than stupidity. People could come in early and leave early, or come in late and stay late, or work from home a couple days a week if their job allowed it, because shockingly, adults are capable of managing their own schedules without a babysitter monitoring their every move. Productivity actually went up, which shouldn't have been surprising, but apparently was to the old guard who thought that if they couldn't physically see someone sitting at a desk, that person must be at home eating bonbons and watching soap operas. Then I started a mentorship program for the interns, which was long overdue because the previous system had basically been throw them in the deep end and see who drowns. We paired every intern with an experienced employee who actually wanted to teach instead of just using them as personal coffee fetchers and copy machine operators. We gave them real projects, real responsibility, and real feedback that didn't just consist of criticism delivered via aggressive emails at midnight. Turns out, when you invest in young talent instead of exploiting them, They become loyal employees who actually want to stay with your company instead of fleeing the moment they get a better offer. Revolutionary concept, I know. But my personal favorite innovation, the one that got the most pushback initially but ended up being wildly popular, was what I called Stay in Bed Wednesday. Once a month, every employee got a mental health day that they could use for literally anything: sleeping in, going to the doctor, sitting in a park staring at trees, having an existential crisis in the comfort of their own home, whatever they needed. No questions asked, no judgment, no having to fake a cough on the phone to convince someone you were actually sick. The first time I announced it at a company-wide meeting, you could hear a pin drop because people genuinely thought I was joking. When they realized I was serious, the relief in that room was palpable. One woman actually teared up, which made me realize exactly how badly people had been burning out under the previous regime. The staff loved all of it. We went from having a Glassdoor rating that would make a sweatshop blush to being named one of the best places to work in the city, and our retention rate shot up so dramatically that HR stopped having panic attacks every time they checked the resignation folder. People started actually smiling in the hallways, which sounds like such a small thing, but was a massive change from the atmosphere of quiet desperation that had previously permeated the building. The break room, which used to be this sad space where people microwaved depressing lunches while avoiding eye contact, turned into an actual social hub where employees from different departments actually talked to each other like colleagues instead of competitors fighting over scraps. Camille tried to take credit at first, which was so predictably her that I couldn't even be annoyed about it. She'd do interviews with business magazines and talk about her vision for a more progressive workplace and her commitment to employee wellness, conveniently forgetting to mention that she'd fought me on literally every single one of these changes initially. When the first article came out praising President Royce's innovative leadership style, I left it on the kitchen counter with a sticky note that just said "really?" with about 15 question marks. She had the decency to look embarrassed, at least. But then something interesting happened. The media started digging deeper, doing actual journalism instead of just regurgitating press releases. And they figured out that the mysterious turnaround had less to do with Camille and more to do with President Royce's husband, whose background in technology and operations management had been vastly underutilized until recent months. One particularly thorough reporter from a major business publication even tracked down some of the employees who'd resigned during the Great Resignation, and they spilled everything about the toxic culture, the fraud, and how the company had been circling the drain until someone, and they were very clear about who that someone was, had stepped in and cleaned house. The article that came out was titled "The Man Behind the Miracle: How an Underestimated Husband Saved His Wife's Failing Empire," which was both accurate and absolutely mortifying for Camille. I found her reading it on her tablet one morning, her coffee getting cold next to her, and her expression cycling through embarrassment, frustration, and maybe a tiny bit of pride. When she looked up and saw me watching her, she sighed and said, "You're actually good at this. Not, 'I was wrong about you,' or 'Thank you for saving my company,' but 'You're actually good at this,' which for Camille was basically the equivalent of a ticker tape parade and a key to the city. "Don't tell anyone," I said, pouring myself coffee and sitting down across from her. "I have a lazy reputation to protect. If people think I'm competent, they'll start expecting things from me. And then where will I be? Actually having to attend meetings and contribute meaningfully? No thanks." She shook her head, but she was smiling now, a real smile that reached her eyes. "How did you know?" she asked. "How did you know what would work?" I shrugged, taking a sip of my coffee. "I just asked people what they needed and then actually gave it to them. Radical concept, I know, but sometimes the simplest answer is the right one." 1 year after the Great Resignation, the fraud revelations, and the complete overhaul of everything that had been broken at Royce and Bell Financial, we hosted the company's biggest celebration yet. It wasn't just any party. This was a full-blown gala at one of those fancy hotels downtown, where the chandeliers probably cost more than most people's houses, and the appetizers were so small and pretentious that you needed about 40 of them to feel like you'd actually eaten something. The event was officially billed as the Annual Excellence Awards and Company Milestone Celebration, but everyone knew it was really a victory lap for surviving what should have been a catastrophic implosion and somehow coming out stronger on the other side. The ballroom was packed with employees, board members, clients, and even some media people who'd been following our corporate resurrection story like it was their favorite Netflix series. Everyone was smiling, actually genuinely smiling. Not the forced corporate smile that people do when they're being paid to pretend they're happy, but the real kind that comes from actually enjoying where they work and who they work with. People were laughing, mingling across departments without that weird territorial vibe that used to exist, and the overall atmosphere was one of celebration rather than obligation. It was like night and day compared to the company events from Eleanor's era, which had always felt more like mandatory performances where everyone was afraid to relax because the queen was watching. I stood near the bar, naturally, because open bar at a corporate event is basically the only way to survive corporate events. Watching the whole scene unfold with a drink in my hand, and Zoe beside me providing color commentary on everyone's outfits and behavior. Marcus is wearing a tie that doesn't look like it came from a clearance rack circa 1998, she observed, gesturing with her champagne glass. Character development. Patricia walked by with her husband, actually laughing at something he'd said, looking more relaxed than I'd ever seen her during work hours. Even Jude was there, wearing a suit instead of his usual maintenance uniform, chatting with some of the executives like he'd always been part of their world rather than the invisible person who emptied their trash cans. Henderson found me eventually, because apparently even at parties the board chairman couldn't just relax and had to make the rounds ensuring everyone knew he'd attended. Hell of a year, he said, raising his glass to me in a toast. When Eleanor passed, I'll admit I thought we were looking at the beginning of the end. Her daughter had the name and the education, but none of the instinct, and the vultures were already circling. You saved this company, and more importantly, you saved it without destroying what Eleanor built. You just made it better, more sustainable. That takes real skill. I clinked my glass against his, appreciating the acknowledgement even though I was terrible at accepting compliments. I had help, I said, nodding toward where my team was gathered. Good people who actually cared. That's all it really took. Camille took the stage around 9 o'clock, after everyone had consumed enough champagne to be in a generous mood, but before anyone got sloppy drunk and embarrassing. She looked incredible, I had to admit. Wearing this emerald green dress that probably cost more than a used car, her hair styled perfectly, carrying herself with the kind of confidence that comes from actually earning your position rather than just inheriting it. The room quieted down as she tapped the microphone, and I braced myself for whatever she was about to say because with Camille, you never quite knew if you were going to get genuine emotion or corporate speak. A year ago, she began, her voice carrying across the ballroom with practiced ease. This company was falling apart. We'd lost key personnel, we'd lost trust, we'd lost direction. My mother had built an empire, and I was terrified that I was going to be the one who destroyed it through incompetence or ignorance or just sheer bad luck. She paused, and I could see her scanning the crowd until her eyes found mine. But I wasn't alone, even though I was too proud and too stubborn to recognize it at the time. Tonight, I want to raise a toast to the man I underestimated, the man I called an idiot more times than I can count, the man who saved this company not because he had to, but because he actually cared enough to try. The crowd turned to look at me, and I felt my face getting warm because public recognition was absolutely not my thing. Zoe elbowed me in the ribs and whispered, "She's talking about you, genius. Try to look humble." Camille continued, and there was genuine emotion in her voice now, not the rehearsed kind but the real, slightly messy kind that comes from actually feeling things. To my husband, who made me realize that leadership isn't about control or fear or making people respect you through intimidation. It's about trust, collaboration, and actually giving a damn about the people who show up every day to make this place work. It's about being willing to admit when you're wrong, to learn, to change, and to build something better than what came before. Everyone clapped, raising their glasses, and I did that awkward half-wave thing that people do when they're being acknowledged but don't want to seem like they're enjoying the attention too much. After the toast, people started coming up to me, shaking my hand, thanking me for specific changes that had impacted their lives. The flexible hours that let someone pick up their kid from school, the mental health days that had literally saved someone from burnout, the mentorship program that had given an intern the confidence to pursue a career they'd been doubting. Each conversation was a reminder that the work we'd done had actual human impact, that these weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet, but but real people whose lives were genuinely better because we decided to give a damn. Later, as the party was winding down and people were starting to drift toward the exits with that satisfied exhaustion that comes from a good celebration, Camille and I left together. We walked through the hotel lobby, past the elaborate decorations and the late-night stragglers, and out into the cool evening air. The valet brought our car around, and we sat there for a moment in comfortable silence, both processing the evening in our own ways. "You really enjoy saying perfect, don't you?" she asked, glancing at me with a smile that was equal parts amused and exasperated. I grinned, starting the car and pulling out into the relatively quiet downtown traffic. "Every time you panic, it's my favorite word," I admitted. "It's become my catchphrase. I'm thinking of getting it printed on business cards." She shook her head, but she was still smiling, and I realized that we'd somehow managed to come out of this whole disaster actually understanding each other better than we had in our entire marriage. We'd gone through the corporate equivalent of a natural disaster and had somehow ended up stronger for it, which was either a testament to our resilience or evidence that we were both slightly insane. Probably both. As we drove home through the city streets, I turned to her at a red light and said, "Next time you call me an idiot, at least remember, this idiot saved your empire." She rolled her eyes in that way that had once annoyed me, but now felt almost affectionate, like an inside joke we'd developed over years of marriage. "You're impossible," she said, but there was no heat in it, just acceptance and maybe even appreciation. I let that word hang in the air for a moment, savoring it, and then delivered my final line with perfect timing. "Perfect." And for once, for the first time maybe ever, she laughed. Not a polite chuckle or a forced social laugh, but a real, genuine burst of laughter that filled the car and made me laugh too. We drove the rest of the way home like that. Two people who'd almost destroyed each other and their company in the process of figuring out how to actually work together, how to actually be partners instead of adversaries. It wasn't a fairy tale ending where everything was suddenly perfect and all our problems disappeared. But it was real, it was honest, and it was ours. And honestly, that was pretty damn perfect.